I am Donovan, 73 years old, and I recently learned that the hardest part of building a fortress is realizing you locked the enemy inside with you. I spent my entire adult life constructing a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate empire, but last month my world collapsed in a single afternoon. It was supposed to be a romantic surprise for our 40th wedding anniversary. Instead, I pushed open the heavy mahogany door of my wife's office and caught her with another man. But the physical betrayal was only the beginning of a nightmare that would test everything I had ever built. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up and reclaim your life from toxic people. The day started with a jewelry box. It was a custom-made diamond necklace that cost $15,000 resting in a black velvet case in my coat pocket. I had driven across town to the luxury interior design firm that I completely funded for my wife Camille. She was 65 years old, but she spent a fortune making sure she looked 20 years younger. I walked past the receptionist who was away from her desk and moved quietly down the hallway with its imported Italian marble floors and expensive modern art. I wanted to surprise her. I wanted to take her to a private lunch to celebrate 4 decades of marriage. As I approached her corner office, I heard voices. They were low and breathy. I did not knock. I simply pushed the heavy door open with a smile on my face. That smile died instantly. Camille was sitting on the edge of her massive glass desk. Her legs were wrapped tightly around the waist of Darius. Darius was 38 years old and held the meaningless title of creative director at the firm. He was a man whose entire salary and lifestyle were paid for by my construction company. They pulled apart the moment the door clicked open. But they were not fast enough. I saw exactly what was happening. I stood frozen in the doorway, the small velvet box, feeling like a lead weight in my hand. I expected screams. I expected tears. I expected my wife of 40 years to fall to her knees and beg for my forgiveness. Instead, Camille simply slid off the desk and let out a long, exasperated sigh. She did not look ashamed. She looked annoyed. She slowly straightened her expensive designer skirt and brushed a lock of hair out of her eyes. She looked at me with cold calculation. "You know Donovan?" she said, her voice dripping with irritation. "It is incredibly rude to come barging into my private office without calling first. Are you spying on me now? Are you that insecure?" I could not believe what I was hearing. She had just been caught betraying our marriage in the office I paid for, and she was trying to make me the villain. I turned my gaze to Darius. He did not look frightened either. He slowly buttoned his tailored suit jacket and adjusted his silk tie. He let out a soft, arrogant chuckle. He leaned against the desk, crossed his arms, and looked me up and down. "You should listen to your wife, Donovan," he sneered. "Your heart cannot take this kind of stress. Just calm down, old man, and go back to your golf clubs. Let the adults handle the business." Old man. The words echoed in the large office. I looked at Darius and saw a boy with soft hands who had never worked a hard day in his life. He wore expensive cologne and talked about synergy and brand aesthetics while spending my money. Then I looked down at my own hands. They were large, calloused, and permanently scarred. I did not inherit a single dime of my wealth. I was not born into a country club family. My mind flashed back to the brutal winters of Chicago in 1974. I was a young black man trying to break into the commercial construction industry. The white developers laughed at me. The banks refused to give me loans. I was told to stick to pushing brooms and hauling trash. But I refused to be invisible. I worked 3 shifts a day pouring concrete in sub-zero temperatures until my fingers bled and my joints screamed in agony. I carried bricks up 6 flights of stairs because the union workers would not let me use the freight elevator. I built Apex Development from the dirt up, fighting tooth and nail against a system designed to keep me at the bottom. I endured the racial slurs, the closed doors, and the backroom deals. I sacrificed my youth, my sleep, and my health to build a fortress so my family would never know the cold. And now, 40 years later, I was standing in a climate-controlled office, watching a spoiled young man and my greedy wife mock the very foundation of my life. Camille had forgotten what it took to buy the designer clothes she was currently wearing. She had forgotten the nights I came home covered in cement dust, too exhausted to speak just so we could make payroll. She had grown accustomed to the luxury, and somewhere along the way, she had lost her respect for the man who provided it. The anger that rose in my chest was not a hot, explosive fire. It was a cold, calculating glacier. I knew that if I yelled or raised my fists, I would be playing into their hands. I would be the angry, unstable old man they wanted me to be. I refused to give them the satisfaction of my pain. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the black velvet box. Camille saw it, and for a brief second a flash of greedy curiosity crossed her eyes. She knew it was our anniversary. She knew I always bought her something extravagant. I opened the box, slowly revealing the brilliant $15,000 diamond necklace. It sparkled under the expensive office lights, a symbol of a lifetime of hard work and devotion. I did not throw it at her. I did not say a single word. I simply turned to the side and dropped the open box into the metal trash can by the door. It landed among the crumpled papers and coffee cups with a dull thud. Camille's jaw tightened. Darius stopped smirking. The silence in the room became absolute and heavy. I looked at them one last time, my face a mask of stone. Then I turned around and walked out of the office. I did not slam the door. I left it wide open so the entire staff could see the creative director and the owner's wife standing in awkward silence. I walked down the long marble hallway, my posture straight and my steps measured. My heart was pounding, but my mind was moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour. I knew exactly what I needed to do. Camille and Darius thought they were clever. They thought I was just a tired old man who would quietly retreat and cry about a broken heart. They had no idea that they had just awakened a sleeping titan. I walked out of the building and got into my heavy black luxury sedan. I did not drive home. I drove straight into the financial district. My plan was simple and ruthless. I was the sole founder of Apex Development. The interior design firm Camille ran was nothing but a subsidiary, a pet project funded entirely by a corporate account that I controlled. I was going to freeze every single dime. I was going to cut off the credit cards, stop the payroll for Darius, and let them realize exactly whose money they were spending. I pulled up to the massive glass and steel building of my primary bank. I had done business here for 30 years. I knew the branch manager by name. I walked through the revolving doors carrying the weight of my anger like a weapon. I bypassed the standard line and walked directly up to the premier banking desk. A young teller in a crisp suit looked up and smiled in recognition. "Good afternoon, Mr. Sterling," the teller said politely. "How can we assist you today?" I leaned against the marble counter. "I need to put an immediate freeze on all corporate accounts related to the Camille Sterling Design Group," I said, my voice low and firm. "Cancel all active credit cards tied to that subsidiary and block any outgoing wire transfers effective immediately." The teller nodded and began typing rapidly on his keyboard. "Of course, sir, let me pull up the master profile for Apex Development." I stood there waiting for the confirmation. I pictured Camille trying to buy her expensive lunch with Darius only to have her platinum card declined. I pictured the panic setting in when she realized the free ride was over. But as I watched the teller's face, the polite smile suddenly faded. He stopped typing. He frowned and leaned closer to his monitor, his eyes scanning the screen rapidly. He clicked his mouse a few times and then swallowed hard. He looked up at me, and I could see a strange mixture of confusion and profound pity in his eyes. "Mr. Sterling," the teller said, his voice trembling slightly, "I am so sorry, but I cannot process this request." "What do you mean you cannot process it?" I demanded. "I am the primary account holder. I am the founder of the company. Freeze the accounts." The teller shook his head and slowly turned his monitor so I could see the screen. Stamped across my financial profile in bold red letters were the words, "Access restricted by legal mandate." "Sir," the teller whispered, looking around nervously, "your access to all Apex Development corporate accounts and personal trusts was revoked completely. It happened about an hour ago." I stared at the screen, the words blurring together. An hour ago. Right around the time I was walking into the design firm, the cold realization began to creep up my spine. This was not just an affair. This was a coordinated attack. I looked back at the teller, my chest tightening. "Who revoked my access?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. The teller looked at his screen again, and then back at me. "It was your son Kendrick, sir. He submitted a court-ordered document granting him full power of attorney. He is now the sole authorized signatory for the entire empire." I stared at the young bank teller, my mind struggling to process the words he had just spoken. Revoked. Power of attorney. I slammed my hand down flat against the polished marble counter. The sharp sound echoed through the quiet lobby, causing several wealthy clients to turn their heads. I demanded to see the branch manager immediately. I did not ask politely. I I used the heavy, gravelly voice that had commanded massive construction sites and corporate boardrooms for 40 years. The young teller scurried away behind frosted glass doors, leaving me alone with the crushing weight of the revelation. I stood there watching the other patrons go about their trivial daily business, completely unaware that an empire was being stolen right in front of them. A few moments later, the branch manager emerged. His name was Harrison. I had played golf with him for over a decade. I had helped secure the commercial lease for this very building when his superiors were looking to relocate. I had trusted him with the financial lifeblood of my company. But today, Harrison would not look me in the eye. He walked over with a thick manila folder clutched tightly to his chest like a shield. He looked absolutely terrified, pale, and sweating under the harsh fluorescent lights of the bank. He asked me in a trembling voice to step into his private office, but I refused to move a single inch from the lobby floor. I told him to explain right there in front of everyone how my own son had managed to hijack my entire life work. Harrison sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping in total defeat. He opened the folder with shaking hands and slid thick legal documents across the counter toward me. The paper resting on the top had a bold official county court seal stamped in the upper right corner, a mark of absolute governmental authority. I picked it up, my calloused fingers brushing against the crisp premium parchment. My eyes scanned the dense, complex legal text, searching for any sign of a mistake. It was a medical power of attorney, signed by a sitting judge just 48 hours ago while I was recovering from a minor winter flu. The document officially declared me mentally unfit to manage my own affairs due to a sudden and severe onset of advanced dementia. The medical evaluation attached to the back was signed by a private physician I had never met in my entire life, a doctor bought and paid for by my treacherous family. It granted my son Kendrick absolute and unconditional control over my medical decisions, my personal assets, and the entirety of Apex Development. I looked up from the paper, feeling a cold knot forming in my stomach. Harrison swallowed hard and whispered that there was absolutely nothing the bank could do to reverse the action. The court order was ironclad and effective immediately. I left the bank without saying another word, pushing past the heavy glass doors and stepping out into the brutal afternoon. The cold Chicago wind hit my face as I walked back to my luxury sedan, but I did not feel the chill. A burning, blinding fury was radiating through my veins, pumping adrenaline into every corner of my aging body. This was not just a greedy wife trying to steal a few $1 million in a messy divorce settlement. This was a highly coordinated, vicious coup designed to strip me of my dignity and my freedom. They had planned this for months, plotting in the shadows while smiling at my dinner table. Camille had distracted me with her lies about late nights at the design firm, while Kendrick went behind my back to a corrupt doctor and a compliant judge to legally erase my existence from the world. I gripped the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned pale white, staring through the windshield at the gray city sky. I did not drive back to the interior design firm to scream at my cheating wife and her arrogant young lover. I drove straight toward the affluent northern suburbs, leaving the city limits behind. I was going to see my son. I needed to look Kendrick in the eye and see the betrayal for myself before I did anything else. The drive took 45 minutes of heavy traffic, but it felt like 5 seconds of silent, agonizing focus. I pulled through the open iron gates of his sprawling, manicured estate, the tires crunching softly on the crushed gravel driveway. I bought this $4 million house for Kendrick and his white wife Chloe as a wedding gift 7 years ago using cash from a major commercial development project. At the time, I thought I was setting them up for a lifetime of comfort and security, hoping to give them a foundation to build a beautiful family. I wanted to give my son the beautiful, easy life that the brutal streets of my youth had aggressively denied me. But sitting in their circular driveway, looking at the massive stone columns and the pristine landscaping, I realized the terrible, monumental mistake I had made. By handing Kendrick the keys to a kingdom he did not bleed to earn, I had stripped him of his spine and his character. I had raised a weak, compliant boy who was easily manipulated by anyone with a stronger will. And nobody had a stronger, more vicious will than his manipulative wife. Chloe came from an old money family that had secretly gone completely bankrupt before she even met my son, hiding their debts behind expensive clothes and arrogant attitudes. She married Kendrick purely for my wealth, seeing my son as nothing more than a convenient automated teller machine. She always looked down on us, viewing our hard-earned black wealth as loud, new, and culturally unsophisticated. She deeply resented my absolute authority over the family business, and she despised the fact that Kendrick always looked to me for approval instead of begging for hers. I did not bother ringing the ornate brass doorbell. I turned the handle, found it unlocked, and pushed the heavy oak doors wide open, letting them slam against the interior walls. The house was dead silent, save for the soft, pretentious sound of classical music playing from hidden ceiling speakers. I marched through the grand foyer, my heavy footsteps echoing loudly against the imported Italian tile that I had personally paid to have shipped across the ocean. Kendrick, I bellowed, my voice shaking the massive crystal chandelier hanging from the vaulted ceiling above. Get out here right now and face me like a man. I walked into the massive sunlit kitchen, expecting a confrontation. Kendrick was sitting on a velvet bar stool at the massive marble kitchen island, staring down at his empty hands. He was wearing a casual cashmere sweater, looking every bit the spoiled, sheltered prince I had foolishly created. He jumped violently when he heard my voice, his head snapping up in sheer panic, but the moment his eyes met mine, he immediately looked away toward the floor. He could not hold my gaze for even a single second. The guilt and shame radiated off him like visible heat from a winter radiator. He opened his mouth to speak, trying to form a coherent sentence, but no words came out of his throat. He just stared at the marble countertop, a pathetic, heartbreaking portrait of pure cowardice. Before I could demand a detailed explanation, a sharp, arrogant laugh echoed from the adjacent sunroom. Chloe stepped slowly into the kitchen, wearing a luxurious silk robe and holding a tall crystal flute filled with a morning mimosa. She did not look surprised to see me standing in her kitchen, breathing heavy with rage. She looked incredibly satisfied, like a hunter admiring a trapped animal. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her orange drink, leaning casually against the expensive stainless steel refrigerator I had paid for. "Well, look who finally decided to drop by," Chloe said, her voice dripping with venomous condescension and unearned superiority. "You really should not be driving a vehicle in your current mental state, Donovan. It is very dangerous for a man with your severe and rapid cognitive decline to be operating heavy machinery." I ignored her insulting performance completely and took a heavy step toward my son, forcing him to flinch. "Kendrick, look at me," I commanded, refusing to let him hide. "You went behind my back to a judge. You told a court of law that your own father has advanced dementia. You maliciously froze the bank accounts of the company I built with my bare, bleeding hands before you were even born. Why did you do this to me?" Kendrick swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat as he struggled to find his voice. He finally looked up, his eyes glassy and fearful, like a child caught stealing. "Dad," he stammered weakly, wiping a nervous sweat from his forehead. "It is for your own good. You have been acting so strangely lately. You are making bad financial decisions. You need rest and professional care." Before he could finish his pathetic, rehearsed speech, Chloe stepped forward and placed a manicured hand firmly on his shoulder, silencing him instantly. She smiled at me, a cold, predatory grin that made the blood in my veins boil with unprecedented hatred. "Kendrick is just doing what is legally and morally best for the family, Donovan," she said smoothly, savoring every single word. "We all know you have been losing your mind for months now. Just look at how incredibly paranoid and aggressive you have become. You actually went to the office and believed Camille is having a romantic affair with a man 30 years younger than her. That wild, baseless paranoia is a clear, undeniable medical sign of a rapidly deteriorating brain. You are hallucinating betrayals that do not exist because your mind is literally rotting away inside your skull." The sheer, calculated audacity of her lie hit me like a physical blow to the chest, knocking the wind out of my lungs for a brief second. She knew exactly what Camille was doing in that office with Darius. They all knew about the affair, and they had all kept it a secret from me. They had weaponized my inevitable discovery of the cheating wife to expertly paint me as a delusional, paranoid old man seeing things that were not real. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, gaslighting, and legalized corporate theft. Chloe had orchestrated this entire bloodless coup from the comfort of her suburban mansion. She had perfectly used my wife's vain greed and my son's pathetic cowardice to completely seize control of a $150 million commercial real estate empire without ever getting her own soft hands dirty. I looked at the glass of mimosa resting in her hand and felt an overwhelming primitive urge to smash it against the beautiful tiled wall behind her. "You actually think you have won this game?" I said, my voice dropping from a shout to a dangerous, deadly whisper that carried the weight of my entire life. "You honestly think a single piece of paper signed by a corrupt doctor gives you the right to steal my life and lock me away? I will absolutely destroy you, Chloe." I will tear this beautiful house down to the concrete foundation, and I will leave you and your bankrupt family with absolutely nothing." Chloe did not flinch or back away from my threat. Her smile only grew wider and more malevolent, stretching across her face like a satisfied snake preparing to swallow its prey whole. She took another slow, arrogant sip of her alcoholic drink and set the crystal glass down on the marble counter with a sharp, definitive clink. "I do not think you will be destroying anything ever again, Donovan," she said sweetly, her voice laced with pure poison. "In fact, you are going to be taking a very long, very quiet medical vacation starting right now." She casually snapped her fingers in the air. The heavy wooden doors leading to the catering kitchen suddenly swung open with a loud bang. Two massive private security guards stepped quickly into the room. They were huge, heavily muscled men wearing unmarked tactical black uniforms and carrying heavy-duty zip ties and batons on their utility belts. They did not look like compassionate healthcare nurses. They looked like expensive, ruthless mercenaries hired to do a dirty job. They stepped forward in unison, perfectly blocking my only exit to the hallway. Chloe crossed her arms over her silk robe and tilted her head, her eyes shining with absolute undeniable triumph. "It is time for you to go to your new assisted living facility, Donovan," she smiled, showing her teeth. "And do not worry about a single thing. We will take wonderful, perfect care of your money while you rot in a locked room for the rest of your natural life." The two massive mercenaries stepped forward, closing the distance. They expected an easy job. They expected a fragile 73-year-old man with a rotting brain who would simply collapse in fear and let them drag him away. They clearly did not research how I made my fortune. I did not spend my life sitting behind a mahogany desk. I spent 40 years lifting steel beams and wrestling concrete blocks. My hands were thick and my bones were dense. I grabbed the heavy marble bar stool resting against the kitchen island. I swung it with every ounce of primitive, brutal strength I had left in my body. The heavy marble base slammed directly into the guard's knee with a loud crunch. He let out a guttural scream and collapsed to the floor, clutching his leg in pure agony. The second guard hesitated for a fraction of a second, shocked by the violent explosion of force from an elderly man. That fraction of a second was all I needed. I shoved my shoulder violently into his chest, knocking him off balance and driving him backward into the massive stainless steel refrigerator. Chloe screamed, dropping her crystal glass of mimosa as it shattered across the expensive Italian tile floor. I did not look back at my weak son or his venomous wife. I ran down the hallway, out the heavy oak front doors, and jumped into my luxury sedan. I slammed the engine into gear and tore out of the circular driveway, leaving deep black tire marks across their pristine, crushed gravel. I was not going to a state medical facility. I was a free man, and I was going to my own home. My heart pounded aggressively against my ribs as I navigated the winding suburban roads. I needed to get to my private estate immediately to access my personal safe and my encrypted computer servers. I had emergency funds hidden away for catastrophic situations. I drove recklessly, pushing the heavy sedan to its absolute mechanical limits until I finally reached the familiar tree-lined street of my sprawling property. I pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates that guarded the entrance to my sanctuary, but something was completely wrong. The gates were tightly shut, but they were not just electronically locked. A thick, heavy steel chain was wrapped securely around the center bars, secured with a massive industrial padlock. I rolled down my window and reached out to the digital keypad mounted on the stone pillar. I typed in my private access code. The red light flashed twice, and a loud, harsh beep echoed in the freezing cold air. "Access denied." I typed it again, pressing the numbers harder, hoping it was just a technical glitch. "Access denied." They had not just frozen my corporate bank accounts and seized my company. They had completely deleted my existence from the security system of my own home. I turned the car engine off and stepped out into the biting chill of the late afternoon. The harsh wind whipped through the bare branches of the ancient oak trees as I walked slowly up to the iron bars. I grabbed the cold steel and shook the heavy gates with all my might, but they did not move a single inch. I was effectively locked out of my own castle. I looked down at the muddy ground near the stone security pillar. Sitting in the wet dirt were 3 expensive leather suitcases. They were my personal bags. They had been carelessly thrown over the high fence, landing in the mud like discarded garbage. Some of my custom-tailored shirts and expensive Italian suits were spilling out of a broken zipper, soaking up the dirty, freezing water. My own wife had packed my life into bags and tossed me onto the pavement like a stray dog. As I stood there staring at my ruined clothes, my cell phone buzzed violently in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the bright screen. It was a picture message from Camille. I opened the message and felt a fresh wave of cold, furious rage wash over me. It was a photograph taken inside my own massive living room. Camille was sitting on my custom Italian leather sofa, her legs crossed casually. Next to her, with his arm draped intimately over her shoulders, was Darius. They were both holding glasses of my rarest vintage champagne, smiling brightly and arrogantly for the camera. Beneath the picture was a short, typed text message. The message told me to stop embarrassing myself and just accept my forced medical retirement like a good, obedient boy. It told me the house was under new management and the local police would be called immediately if I tried to trespass on their private property. They were drinking my expensive wine, sitting on my custom furniture, and telling me I was a criminal trespasser in the exact house my own blood and sweat had built. I did not reply to the insulting text message. I simply turned off the phone and slipped it back into my heavy coat pocket. I stood entirely alone on the wet pavement outside the gates of a $15 million estate that I legally owned but could no longer enter. A weaker man might have fallen to his knees and wept in despair. A softer man might have driven back to his son's house and surrendered to the private mercenaries just to have a warm, comfortable bed for the night. But as the freezing wind bit deeply through my thin suit jacket, I did not feel weak. I felt a sudden, profound sense of absolute mental clarity. The bitter, cold air did not frighten me. It awakened me. It transported my mind back to a brutal, unforgiving winter in 1977. I was 28 years old with exactly $20 to my name. I had just started my construction company, and I had to choose between paying the rent on my tiny apartment or paying my small, dedicated crew of workers. I chose my men. I spent 3 grueling weeks sleeping in the cab of my unheated pickup truck parked in an empty, frozen dirt lot. I wrapped myself in dirty moving blankets and shivered through the long, dark nights, surviving on stale bread and cheap black coffee. I remembered the fierce, relentless hunger that kept me awake. I remembered the absolute determination that burned like a furnace in my chest. I survived that terrible winter, and I built a massive empire. Camille and Chloe falsely believed that taking away my credit cards and locking my doors would easily break my spirit. They thought I had grown soft because I wore expensive tailored suits and drank fine vintage wine. They fundamentally misunderstood who I was at my core. I was not a fragile product of luxury. I was a hardened product of survival. The cold pavement was not a punishment to me. It was my original home. I walked back to my luxury sedan and opened my leather wallet. I pulled out the cash I always kept hidden for extreme emergencies. I had exactly $300 in crisp $20 bills. I pulled out my sleek black corporate credit card, the one with absolutely no spending limit, and snapped it in half, throwing the useless plastic pieces into the mud next to my ruined luggage. I climbed back into the driver's seat and started the engine. I did not drive to a luxury hotel downtown. I knew they would track my location if I tried to use my real name. I drove toward the forgotten industrial edge of the city where the neon signs flickered and the buildings were covered in thick grime. I found a rundown motel squeezed between a dirty liquor store and a vacant, overgrown lot. The cracked sign out front advertised rooms for $40 a night. I walked into the dingy lobby smelling heavily of stale cigarette smoke and cheap bleach. I handed the clerk 2 $20 bills and took the heavy brass key to room number 7. I walked into the small, dark room and locked the door securely behind me. The floral wallpaper was peeling and the bedspread was thin and faded. It was perfect. I sat down on the edge of the lumpy mattress and reached into the hidden compartment inside my leather shoe. I pulled out a small, cheap burner phone. I bought it years ago for discreet business negotiations and kept it charged just in case. I turned the device on and dialed a number I had committed to memory but had not called in over 2 decades. The phone rang 3 times before a rough, gravelly voice answered on the other end. It was Sterling. Sterling was a ruthless, disbarred corporate fixer who operated entirely in the dark shadows of the city. He was a dangerous man who destroyed lives, erased records, and solved impossible problems for a very high price. He had been exiled from the legitimate business world 20 years ago, and I was the only person who still knew how to find him. I told him my name. I told him my family had just stolen my entire empire using a forged medical order and locked me out of my life. I heard a low, dark chuckle on the other end of the line. Sterling asked me what I wanted him to do. I looked at the peeling wallpaper and thought about the picture of Darius drinking my champagne. I told Sterling I did not want to negotiate. I told him I wanted to burn their entire world to the ground and leave them with absolutely nothing. Sterling told me he would meet me in 1 hour. I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet, dim light of the motel room. The coup was officially over. The war had just begun. I sat on the edge of the lumpy motel mattress, listening to the hum of the broken air conditioner. It had been 3 hours since I called Sterling. I knew a man like him needed time to gather his tools and navigate the shadows of the city. I was wearing the same suit I had worn to my anniversary nightmare, but it felt different now. It felt like battle armor. I was reviewing the mental blueprints of my empire, calculating exactly which structural supports I needed to kick out to make the entire building collapse on top of my treacherous family. Then a sharp, confident knock echoed against the thin wooden door of my room. I did not move immediately. I waited, listening to the sound of expensive leather heels shifting impatiently on the concrete walkway outside. It was not Sterling. Sterling did not make noise. I stood up, walked slowly to the door, and unlocked the deadbolt. I pulled the door open, and the cold night air rushed into the room, carrying the heavy scent of a ridiculously expensive French perfume. Standing in the doorway was Chloe, my arrogant white daughter-in-law. She looked entirely out of place, standing in front of a $40 a night motel room. She was wearing a pristine white cashmere coat and carrying a designer handbag that cost more than the motel owner made in a year. She did not look at me with any trace of familial concern or pity. Her face was set in a mask of supreme confidence and deep disgust as she wrinkled her nose at the smell of stale smoke and bleach radiating from my room. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not ask how I was feeling after being locked out of my own home and left on the street. She simply pushed past me, stepping into the cramped room as if she owned the very floorboards beneath my feet. I closed the door quietly and turned to face her. I let her take in the pathetic surroundings. I wanted her to feel victorious. I wanted her to believe that her little coup had completely broken my spirit. Chloe walked over to the small, wobbly, circular table in the corner of the room. She used a sterilized wipe from her purse to clean the surface before setting her expensive bag down. She looked around the room and let out a soft, condescending laugh. She told me it was a tragedy to see a man of my former stature reduced to hiding in a filthy roadside motel. She said she had tracked me down using the GPS locator she had secretly installed on my luxury sedan months ago under the guise of an insurance upgrade. She claimed she was there on a mission of mercy. She told me she had convinced Camille and Kendrick to hold off on sending the private medical transport team to drag me to the lockdown psychiatric facility. She said she was there to offer me a generous compromise because she still had a tiny shred of respect for the grandfather of her future children. She unzipped her designer bag and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. She slapped the papers down onto the cheap laminate table with a sharp, authoritative thud. She looked me dead in the eye and laid out her generous deal. She explained that the documents were a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and an absolute transfer of rights. She demanded that I quietly sign over my remaining private land patents directly to Kendrick. She knew that while they had frozen the Apex Development bank accounts, they did not have the legal rights to the undeveloped commercial plots I held in my private portfolio. In exchange for surrendering the last pieces of my life work, she promised to convince Camille to permanently drop the medical asylum order. She promised I would be allowed to live the rest of my days in peace in a small retirement community in Florida. To sweeten the deal, she offered me a strict monthly allowance of exactly $3,000. She smiled when she said that number as if she were a benevolent queen tossing table scraps to a starving peasant. $3,000 a month. I had tipped waitresses more than that during holiday dinners. I had spent 40 years building a $150 million empire, and this spoiled, arrogant girl was standing in a cheap motel room offering me an allowance from my own bank accounts. I did not scream. I did not flip the wobbly table. I simply stared at her, letting the silence stretch until it became thick and uncomfortable. Seeing my silence, Chloe decided to push harder. She leaned across the table, her blue eyes narrowing with unfiltered malice. She told me to swallow my massive ego and sign the papers. She insulted my entire legacy right to my face. She said I needed to accept that my time was over and that my life work was nothing but dirt and concrete. She said the future of the Sterling family required sophisticated modern management, not the brute force of an uneducated old man who still thought like a bricklayer. Listening to her speak, I felt a deep, profound clarity about exactly who I was dealing with. Chloe always projected the image of a wealthy, blue-blood aristocrat. She spoke with a refined accent and constantly bragged about her prestigious family lineage. But I knew the absolute truth. I had run a quiet background check on her family the day Kendrick proposed. Her old money family had gone completely bankrupt in the early 2000s. Her father had squandered their generational wealth on terrible investments and hidden gambling debts, leaving them with nothing but an empty mansion and a mountain of unpaid taxes. Chloe had married Kendrick purely for my money. She had actively sought out my weak, desperate son because she knew he was the heir to a massive fortune. She thought she was marrying down racially, but she knew she was marrying up financially. She despised our black wealth, constantly referring to us as loud new money behind our backs. She hated the fact that I had earned my fortune with calloused hands while her father had lost his in country club poker games. She used her fake aristocratic superiority to manipulate Kendrick, making him feel lucky to have a woman of her supposed caliber. She was standing in my room lecturing me about sophisticated management while desperately trying to steal the dirt and concrete that funded her luxury lifestyle. I looked at the papers resting on the table. The legal trap was obvious. They had seized the corporate shell of Apex Development, but they had suddenly realized that the actual land deeds for the upcoming $500 million projects were still locked in my private name. They could not build. They could not sell. They could not cash out without my signature on those specific transfer patents. They were terrified. They knew that without those land patents, their hostile takeover was completely worthless. Chloe was not there out of mercy. She was there out of sheer desperate panic disguised as arrogance. I walked slowly over to the table, pulling my heavy coat around my shoulders. I looked down at the documents and then looked up at Chloe. She held out a sleek, expensive black fountain pen, expecting me to take it and surrender my kingdom. I did not take her pen. I reached into the breast pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a cheap plastic red pen I had taken from the motel front desk. Chloe frowned, slightly confused by my choice of writing instrument, but she did not object. She was too eager to secure the signature. She watched with bated breath as I clicked the red pen and leaned over the documents. I did not argue with her. I did not tell her she was a parasite. I simply smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was a chilling, cold smile that did not reach my eyes. It was the smile of a predator watching a deer walk willingly into a steel trap. I pressed the red pen against the signature line of the absolute transfer of rights. I signed my full legal name, Donovan Marcus Sterling, in bright, vivid red ink. I flipped to the next page and signed the non-disclosure agreement with the same red pen. My signature was steady, precise, and perfectly legible. I gathered the papers, tapped them on the table to align the edges, and handed the entire stack back to my daughter-in-law. Chloe snatched the documents from my hand, her eyes wide with greedy triumph. She quickly flipped through the pages, verifying that I had signed every single required line. She let out a long breath of relief, her arrogant posture returning instantly. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and ultimate victory. She truly believed that she had broken me. She believed that the threat of the psychiatric lockdown facility had terrified me into total submission. She tucked the document safely into her designer handbag and zipped it shut. She told me she would wire the first $3,000 allowance to a new checking account by the end of the week. She told me to enjoy my cheap motel room and advised me not to contact Kendrick ever again. She turned around and walked out the door, her expensive heels clicking away into the cold, dark night, leaving a trail of French perfume in her wake. I stood in the doorway and watched her white cashmere coat disappear into the shadows of the parking lot. I closed the door and engaged the heavy metal deadbolt. I walked over to the motel sink and washed my hands, feeling an overwhelming sense of calm wash over my tired bones. Chloe thought she had just won the entire war. She thought she had secured the final pieces of the Apex Development empire. She had absolutely no idea what she had just done. Back in 1995, I worked closely with the state legislature to draft a series of commercial real estate laws designed to protect vulnerable property owners from aggressive corporate extortion. We wrote an obscure, highly specific loophole into the state property code. According to that specific commercial statute, any transfer of private land patents signed exclusively in red ink is legally recognized as a signature executed under severe duress. The law explicitly dictates that a red ink signature instantly invalidates the entire transfer document, making it completely null and void. But more importantly, the moment a red ink transfer document is filed with the county clerk, it automatically triggers a mandatory federal investigation into criminal extortion and real estate fraud. Chloe thought she was walking away with the keys to my kingdom. She did not realize she was carrying a ticking legal time bomb in her designer handbag. when she and Kendrick proudly submitted those documents to the state, they would not be securing their $500 million project. They would be handing the federal government written undeniable proof of their own extortion scheme. I sat back down on the lumpy motel mattress and waited for Sterling to arrive. My family had tried to bury me alive, but they had forgotten that I was the man who owned the dirt. And I was about to show them exactly what happens when you try to steal a mountain from the man who built it. The morning sun barely pierced the dirty window of my cheap motel room, but I was already awake. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring at the small, flickering television mounted to the wall. The local news channel was broadcasting live from the grand lobby of the Apex Development corporate headquarters, the very same lobby I had designed and paid for with 40 years of relentless sweat. Standing behind a polished mahogany podium were my wife Camille, my son Kendrick, and the man who was currently sleeping in my bed, Darius. They were dressed in solemn dark clothing, looking like they were attending a tragic funeral rather than staging a massive corporate coup. A large crowd of business journalists and industry reporters had gathered to hear the breaking news. Kendrick stepped up to the microphones first, his face carefully arranged in a mask of profound practiced sadness. He read from a prepared statement written by high-priced public relations consultants. He announced to the city that due to a sudden and tragic decline in my mental health, he had assumed full legal control of the company. He spoke about my legacy with fake reverence, calling me a pioneer who sadly could no longer distinguish reality from hallucination. Camille stood right behind him, wiping a dry eye with a lace handkerchief, playing the role of the heartbroken, devoted spouse to absolute perfection. Darius stood off to the side, looking incredibly smug, wearing a tailored suit that I had undoubtedly paid for, looking ready to step into my shoes. Kendrick finished his pathetic speech by introducing Darius as the new interim chief executive officer of Apex Development. Darius stepped up to the podium and flashed a bright, charismatic smile for the flashing cameras. He immediately started talking about corporate synergy, modernizing our archaic business models, and maximizing shareholder value. Listening to his empty, meaningless buzzwords made my stomach turn. He had never poured a single yard of concrete in his entire life. He had never negotiated a tough union contract or stayed up all night worrying about a sudden supply chain delay. He was a luxury interior decorator who thought running a massive commercial real estate empire was as easy as picking out the right shade of paint for a conference room wall. He boldly declared to the press that Apex Development was entering a new era of aggressive expansion and unprecedented profitability under his brilliant leadership. He promised the wealthy investors that he would trim the excess fat from the company and streamline operations within his first 30 days. I watched the reporters furiously taking notes, completely buying into the smooth lies being fed to them. They saw a bright young visionary stepping in to save a failing, mentally unstable old man. They did not see the greedy vultures picking the meat off a living lion. I turned off the television, the screen fading to black, but the image of their smug faces burned brightly in my mind. They thought they had successfully hijacked my life work. They honestly believed that sitting in the big, comfortable chair and holding the corporate checkbook made them the true owners of the massive commercial empire I had single-handedly constructed over 4 decades of brutal, relentless labor. What Camille and Darius fundamentally failed to understand was the true underlying nature of the commercial construction business. You do not build a towering skyscraper with padded bank accounts and glossy press releases. You build it with blood, sweat, and unbreakable absolute loyalty. When I founded Apex Development back in the brutal 1970s, the world was an incredibly hostile, unforgiving place for a young, ambitious black man trying to make a legitimate name for himself. I could not rely on the old boys club or the wealthy banking elite for any favors or financial assistance. I had to rely heavily on the men holding the heavy shovels. The true foundation of my company was not the money locked securely in the bank vault. It was the calloused, scarred hands of the foremen, the welders, the pipe fitters, and the concrete pourers. We bled together on those massive, dangerous job sites, fighting through freezing winter rain and blistering, scorching summer heat. I knew every single one of my senior site managers by their first name. I knew their wives' names. I paid out of my own pocket for their children to go to college. I attended their funerals and celebrated their weddings. We were not just a standard faceless corporation. We were a tight brotherhood forged deeply in the fires of hard, unforgiving labor. I took immense care of my men, and in return, they proudly built me a $150 million fortune. My true authority did not come from a flimsy piece of paper signed by a corrupt, compromised judge. It came directly from the absolute, unwavering respect of the men who actually moved the earth. Darius falsely thought he could simply sit comfortably in my corner office and command my army. But a loyal army only follows a general they deeply respect. It did not take very long for Darius to begin foolishly dismantling everything I had spent 40 decades building from the ground up. By noon that very same day, my small burner phone started ringing loudly in the dim motel room. It was Marcus, my oldest and most incredibly loyal black foreman. Marcus had been standing shoulder to shoulder with me for 35 years, working his way up from a common manual laborer to the senior executive supervisor of our flagship project downtown. Marcus sounded absolutely furious, his voice shaking with pure raw anger over the phone line. He told me that Darius had marched arrogantly onto the active, dangerous job site wearing a pristine yellow hard hat that did not have a single scratch or dent on it. Darius had gathered all the experienced senior foremen and coldly informed them that their long-standing contracts were being immediately terminated to aggressively cut daily operating costs. He carelessly fired good men who had dedicated their entire adult working lives to my company, telling them they were obsolete, too old, and far too expensive to maintain on the payroll. In their place, Darius had already quickly hired a cheap local non-union contracting firm with a notoriously terrible industry reputation for cutting dangerous corners and completely ignoring basic safety protocols. He truly thought he was being a brilliant financial businessman by saving a few $1,000,000 on standard labor costs. He thought the dedicated workers were just easily replaceable numbers on a spreadsheet. I listened quietly as Marcus detailed the absolute horrifying chaos unfolding rapidly on the massive job site. The new replacement contractors were poorly untrained, incredibly sloppy, and completely disorganized. They simply did not understand the highly complex, specialized engineering required for the massive commercial tower we were actively building. They were pouring cheap, wet concrete without proper steel rebar support and deliberately ignoring critical structural blueprints just to desperately stay ahead of the impossible, punishing new schedule Darius had blindly imposed upon them. I told Marcus to pack up his heavy tools and go straight home. I told him to pass the word and tell the rest of my loyal, skilled men to stand down quietly and wait patiently for my specific signal. I promised him firmly that Darius was going to pay dearly for every single insult he had thrown at them. Darius definitely thought he was an absolute, unassailable genius. He probably sat in my plush office drinking my expensive imported liquor, celebrating the massive short-term savings he had just magically created on paper. He was probably planning his next lavish luxury vacation with my treacherous wife, completely convinced that running my massive empire was a simple, fun game that anyone could master. But commercial construction is an incredibly unforgiving, harsh reality where blind arrogance is immediately punished by the strict laws of physics and the government. 2 short days later, the incredibly cheap, unqualified contractors Darius had foolishly hired hit a massive, unavoidable snag on the $500 million flagship commercial tower project in the center of the city. They had improperly poured a massive load-bearing foundation wall that was visibly structurally unsound due to their incredibly rushed, sloppy amateur work. A routine, strict federal building inspector unexpectedly arrived on the busy site to officially sign off on the next critical phase of construction. The inspector was a strict, hardened, no-nonsense man who absolutely did not care about corporate synergy buzzwords or fancy press conferences. He took exactly one look at the dangerous, shoddy workmanship and immediately demanded to see the master building permits and the approved architectural patents for the entire structural framework. The new unqualified site manager nervously handed over the thick stack of paperwork, expecting a simple, quick rubber stamp of approval. The federal inspector reviewed the complex documents thoroughly, and his face turned bright red with absolute furious anger. He realized instantly that the legally required authorized signature on the primary state building permits was completely missing from the paperwork. The permits desperately needed the specific legal authorization of the officially registered land patent holder to proceed. Darius and my foolish son Kendrick had falsely assumed that the corporate management shell of Apex Development actually owned the valuable physical land underneath the building, but they were completely, entirely wrong. The federal inspector aggressively pulled out a bright red warning tag and slapped it violently on the chain link fence surrounding the massive job site. He quickly issued an immediate mandatory total stop work order, halting the entire $500 million project instantly in its tracks. He informed the panicked, sweating site manager that every single physical action they were currently taking was a massive direct federal violation because the master building permits were entirely, totally invalid. The sudden and aggressive halt of the flagship commercial tower project sent a massive shockwave directly through the newly hijacked corporate headquarters of Apex Development. Kendrick was sitting comfortably in his spacious new executive office, admiring the expensive view of the city skyline when his office telephone began ringing violently. The panicked site manager on the other end of the line explained that a strict federal building inspector had just slapped a bright red stop work order on the primary construction gate. The site manager practically screamed into the phone that the massive $500 million project was completely paralyzed because the master building permits were completely invalid. Kendrick felt a sudden cold rush of pure terror wash over his entire body. He immediately hung up the phone and ran frantically down the long marble hallway to the corporate records room. He desperately pulled heavy file boxes off the shelves, tearing through dense stacks of legal paperwork and thick architectural folders. He was looking for the original property deeds to prove to the federal inspector that Apex Development was the absolute lawful owner of the highly valuable downtown real estate. He spent 3 agonizing hours searching through thousands of complex corporate documents, his hands trembling and a cold sweat dripping down his forehead. But the more he read, the more the horrifying truth began to reveal itself. He finally realized the massive, fatal flaw in his perfect hostile takeover. He had successfully seized the corporate bank accounts and assumed full legal control of the Apex Development Management shell, but he did not actually own the physical dirt beneath the buildings. My son was completely oblivious to the deeply complex financial architecture I had spent 4 decades meticulously designing. I never structured my commercial real estate empire like a standard traditional company. Apex Development was nothing more than a highly efficient operational shell. It paid the loyal workers, it managed the heavy construction equipment, and it handled the daily public relations. But Apex Development did not own a single inch of valuable physical real estate. Every single plot of land, every commercial high-rise, and every empty dirt lot was securely held by a massive ghost network of invisible blind trusts. The absolute controlling entity sitting at the very top of that complex invisible pyramid was a private holding company called Vanguard Holdings. I was the sole exclusive proprietor of Vanguard Holdings, and my name was the only authorized signature legally permitted to transfer or develop those specific properties. Kendrick and his greedy wife had essentially hijacked a massive, expensive luxury vehicle without realizing that I still held the only key to the engine. They were sitting in the driver's seat playing pretend while the car was completely immobilized. I learned the absolute vital importance of protecting my hard-earned assets during the incredibly corrupt and hostile business climate of the early 1980s. Back then, powerful, greedy city officials and wealthy white developers frequently colluded to steal valuable commercial properties from independent black business owners. They would aggressively use the brutal legal tool of eminent domain to force us out of our own neighborhoods, claiming the land was urgently needed for public city projects. They would pay us absolute pennies on the dollar and then hand our highly valuable land directly over to their wealthy corporate friends. I watched several good, honest black men lose their entire life savings to that vicious, rigged system. I swore to myself that I would never allow a corrupt politician or a greedy competitor to legally steal the mountain I was building with my bare hands. I hired the most brilliant, relentless real estate attorneys in the country to weave a dense, impenetrable web of legal protection around my physical assets. I buried my true ownership so deep under layers of anonymous corporate trusts that nobody could ever find the bottom. My own son had grown up sleeping in a luxurious mansion funded by that exact ghost network, but he was too incredibly lazy and arrogant to ever ask how the structural foundation actually worked. Kendrick collapsed into a heavy leather chair in the corporate records room, his breathing shallow and rapid. The crushing reality of the situation was violently suffocating him. He picked up his mobile phone and frantically called his wife, Chloe. He begged her to come down to the corporate headquarters immediately. When Chloe marched arrogantly into the messy records room 30 minutes later, she was expecting to celebrate another massive financial victory. Instead, she found her husband sitting on the floor, surrounded by hundreds of scattered legal documents, looking like a completely broken man. Kendrick looked up at her with red, tear-filled eyes and explained the catastrophic failure of their master plan. He told her that my medical power of attorney was absolutely useless when it came to the flagship project. He explained that Vanguard Holdings was a completely separate private legal entity immune to the medical takeover of Apex Development. He told her that without my specific authorized signature on the land transfer patents, the federal government would never allow them to pour another single drop of concrete. Chloe stood frozen in the center of the room, her pristine white designer coat blending into the stark white walls. The smug, arrogant smile that usually danced across her face completely vanished. She slowly realized that her brilliantly executed bloodless coup was rapidly collapsing into a massive financial disaster. Every single day that the massive $500 million project sat idle and paralyzed, the company was bleeding hundreds of thousands of dollars in severe delay penalties and union contract violations. The expensive, wealthy investors they had proudly courted during their flashy press conference would quickly demand their massive investments back if they discovered the new leadership team did not even own the ground they were building on. The massive corporate bank accounts they had so happily seized would be completely drained by aggressive legal fees and mounting daily fines within a few short months. Chloe looked down at my weak, trembling son and felt a sudden, intense surge of absolute disgust. She realized that Kendrick was entirely useless in a real crisis. He was a soft, sheltered boy who completely lacked the ruthless, primitive survival instincts required to navigate a true corporate war. But Chloe was not the type of woman to simply accept defeat and walk away empty-handed. Her entire identity was deeply rooted in her unearned luxury, and she refused to go back to her bankrupt parents begging for financial forgiveness. She walked over to the heavy wooden desk and picked up a blank state land transfer deed. She stared at the crisp white paper, her mind racing through dark, dangerous possibilities. She knew that my red ink signature on the motel documents was specifically tied to my private, undeveloped plots, but the massive downtown flagship project required a completely different set of historical corporate patents. She needed my authorized signature on this specific master deed, and she needed it dated before the medical power of attorney took legal effect. She turned to Kendrick, her blue eyes burning with a cold, desperate fire. She walked slowly toward him and dropped the blank deed directly into his lap. She told him there was only one possible way to save their stolen empire and avoid total, absolute financial ruin. Kendrick looked down at the blank legal document and then looked up at his wife, his face completely pale with raw, terrifying comprehension. He slowly shook his head, his hands trembling violently. He stammered that forging a federal land document was a massive, undeniable crime. He weakly protested that a medical power of attorney was a civil family matter, but forging a master land deed crossed the severe absolute line into a federal felony. He told her that if the federal inspectors or the banking regulators discovered a forged signature, they would both be facing decades in a maximum security federal prison. He begged her to reconsider, to find a clever legal loophole, or to simply negotiate a quiet, peaceful surrender with me. He was perfectly willing to be an unethical, treacherous son, but he was absolutely terrified of becoming a convicted federal criminal. Chloe did not offer him any comfort or alternative solutions. She leaned down so her face was only inches away from his, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. She violently reminded him that they had already crossed the point of no return. She aggressively pointed out that they had already committed medical fraud by bribing a private doctor to declare me mentally unfit. She told him that if their corporate empire collapsed, now the angry, wealthy investors would utterly destroy them in civil court, leaving them penniless and completely homeless. She brutally insulted his manhood, calling him a pathetic, cowardly failure who was too weak to protect his own future. She told him that he possessed my exact genetic handwriting structure, and that he had spent years practicing my signature on minor vendor contracts when I was out of town. She ordered him to pick up a black pen and sign my name on the bottom of the master deed. Kendrick sat in the quiet records room, a profound, heavy silence pressing down on his narrow shoulders. He was caught between his absolute terrifying fear of federal prison and his overwhelming desperate need to please his manipulative wife. He looked at the blank signature line, knowing that the moment the ink touched the paper, his entire life would be forever permanently altered. He would no longer just be a greedy, opportunistic child. He would officially become a desperate, hardened criminal engaged in massive, coordinated federal wire fraud and illegal real estate extortion. He slowly reached across the desk and picked up a heavy black fountain pen. His hand was shaking so violently he could barely grip the smooth metal barrel. Chloe stood directly over him, watching his every single movement with cold, predatory anticipation. She softly encouraged him, whispering dark promises of unlimited wealth and absolute corporate power once the massive tower was finally completed. Kendrick took a deep, ragged breath, closing his eyes for a brief, agonizing second. He thought about my calloused hands and the 40 years of relentless, brutal labor it took to build the massive company he was currently stealing. But his sheer terrifying fear of losing his luxurious, pampered lifestyle ultimately overpowered whatever tiny shred of moral conscience he had left remaining in his soul. He pressed the sharp metal nib of the fountain pen firmly against the thick legal parchment. With slow, deliberate, heavily practiced strokes, he perfectly forged my signature onto the bottom of the backdated land transfer deed. He officially crossed the irreversible boundary, shifting their actions from an unethical family betrayal straight into the realm of a highly punishable, severe federal felony. Chloe snatched the forged document from his trembling hands, a bright, victorious smile stretching across her face. They both falsely believed they had just successfully saved their stolen corporate empire. They had absolutely no idea that I was waiting patiently in the dark shadows, watching their every single move and preparing to spring a massive, inescapable trap that would bury them forever under the very concrete they were trying to steal. I sat in a cracked vinyl booth at a rundown 24-hour diner on the south side of the city. The air smelled strongly of burnt coffee, old cooking grease, and fried onions. Sitting across from me were three large, incredibly intimidating men wearing heavy denim jackets and mud-stained steel-toed boots. They were the executive leaders of the primary labor unions that supplied every single skilled commercial construction worker to Apex Development. I had known these hardened men for well over 30 years. We had bled together on the frozen concrete long before I wore a suit. I did not invite them to this quiet, secluded diner to ask for a desperate personal favor. I did not ask them to organize a massive protest or go on an official strike to save my hijacked company. I simply looked them directly in the eye and told them the absolute horrifying truth. I explained calmly that I had been medically exiled from my own life work by my greedy, treacherous family. I told them that Darius, the arrogant interior designer currently sitting comfortably in my corner office, was actively replacing my seasoned safety inspectors with cheap, unqualified amateur contractors. I told the veteran union leaders that I could no longer personally guarantee the structural safety of the massive, active commercial job sites. In our highly dangerous, unforgiving line of work, a single compromised load-bearing wall or a poorly secured steel beam could instantly brutally kill a dozen good, hard-working men in a matter of terrible seconds. I finished my bitter black coffee, slid a crisp $20 bill across the sticky laminate table, and slowly stood up. I told them they needed to protect their men at all costs because the new, arrogant corporate management certainly would not. I walked out of the diner and into the freezing, bitter night, leaving the three silent, hardened men sitting in the booth to make their own quiet, powerful decisions. While I was drinking that terrible, bitter coffee in a cheap neighborhood diner, my treacherous wife Camille and her young lover Darius were busy spending my hard-earned corporate funds on a massive, ridiculously extravagant celebration. They had rented out the entire spectacular top floor of the most exclusive, expensive luxury hotel downtown to host a lavish victory party for themselves. They invited hundreds of wealthy, disconnected socialites, arrogant investors, and shallow local celebrities. They wanted to formally, loudly announce the bold new modern direction of Apex Development to the city elite. Camille was draped elegantly in a ridiculously expensive, custom-tailored silk gown. Her neck adorned heavily with the absolute finest sparkling diamonds my hijacked bank accounts could possibly buy. She was walking proudly through the crowded, beautiful room holding a crystal glass of imported expensive champagne, laughing loudly, and soaking in the completely unearned admiration of her high society peers. She looked incredibly satisfied and perfectly content, believing she had successfully permanently erased me from her luxurious new reality. Darius was standing confidently by the massive panoramic floor-to-ceiling glass windows wearing a dark velvet tuxedo jacket. He was boasting arrogantly to a small group of incredibly wealthy investment bankers about how he had heroically streamlined the bloated, massive company budget in just a few short days. They were openly celebrating a massive corporate triumph they had absolutely no legitimate right to claim. They were dancing happily and carelessly on the freshly dug grave of my entire life, entirely convinced that they had outsmarted a senile, broken old man. They thought the severe federal stop work order on the flagship project was just a minor temporary administrative hurdle that Kendrick could instantly solve with his newly forged backdated land deed. They were entirely blinded by their own intoxicating, endless greed and profound, staggering arrogance. But reality has a very sharp, unavoidable way of piercing through the thickest illusions. Right in the middle of a pompous, lengthy toast delivered passionately by Darius, the entire spectacular luxury ballroom was violently, unexpectedly plunged into absolute, total, terrifying darkness. The soft, ambient, live jazz music instantly, painfully died. The massive, expensive crystal chandeliers completely shut off without any warning. The only faint illumination in the massive room came from the distant soft glow of the city streetlights far below the massive glass windows. The large crowd of wealthy, superficial socialites gasped loudly in sudden shock and immediate mass confusion. Camille shrieked loudly in the darkness, dropping her delicate crystal champagne flute onto the polished hardwood floor where it shattered violently into 100 invisible sharp pieces. The desperate hotel manager frantically burst into the dark, crowded room holding a small, glowing yellow flashlight, frantically apologizing to the angry, terrified, wealthy guests. He explained with a trembling, panicked voice that a massive, unannounced electrical grid failure had just struck the specific downtown city block, and the massive hotel backup generators were mysteriously completely refusing to properly engage. What the panicked, sweating hotel manager did not know was that the tough veteran electrical union workers responsible for maintaining that specific commercial city grid were fiercely, deeply loyal to me. And those electricians were definitely not the only ones taking swift, decisive, devastating action against the illegitimate corporate regime. At that exact, synchronized, silent moment across the entire sprawling, massive city, 400 highly skilled professional union workers simultaneously dropped tools. The brave, experienced crane operators climbed quietly, safely down from their massive, towering steel machines, leaving them hanging completely empty against the dark city skyline. The hardened concrete pourers aggressively shut off their loud, heavy spinning machinery, leaving the wet cement to dry uselessly inside the massive waiting trucks. The fearless steelworkers carefully secured their heavy safety harnesses and walked firmly, purposefully, away from the exposed, dangerous high-altitude beams. Every single veteran foreman, skilled welder, and expert pipe fitter currently employed across all 14 highly active Apex Development commercial job sites walked off the private property in unwavering unison. They did not carry loud, colorful protest signs demanding higher hourly wages or better health benefits. They did not shout angry, violent demands at the panicked, confused new replacement contractors. They simply securely locked the heavy iron perimeter gates tightly behind them, tossed the brass keys into the dirt, and went straight home to their waiting families. The massive, roaring, unstoppable engine of my $150 million commercial real estate empire ground to a complete, dead, absolutely terrifying halt. The sheer deafening silence of those massive abandoned construction sites echoed loudly, powerfully across the sleeping city tonight. When the emergency backup power finally flickered weakly back on inside the luxury hotel ballroom, the lavish, extravagant party was entirely ruined beyond repair. The wealthy, superficial, elite guests were already rushing frantically toward the gold elevators, complaining loudly, bitterly about the horrible, unacceptable inconvenience of the sudden darkness. But the abruptly ruined luxury party was the absolute least of their massive, rapidly cascading financial problems. Kendrick violently burst through the heavy wooden ballroom doors, his face completely sickly pale and slick with a cold, terrifying, nervous sweat. He ran straight aggressively up to Camille and Darius, wildly waving his illuminated mobile phone. He screamed loudly over the remaining ambient noise that every single active job site in the entire city had just been instantly abandoned by the labor force. He explained breathlessly that the powerful union leaders had just issued a formal, absolute, unbreakable declaration to the press. The 400 skilled professional workers permanently refused to operate under the highly dangerous, incompetent, negligent management of Darius and his cheap amateur replacement contractors. They strongly demanded my immediate unconditional reinstatement as the sole absolute operating authority, or they would never proudly pour another single drop of commercial concrete for the entire stolen company. Darius felt the warm blood drain completely rapidly from his smug, historically arrogant face, leaving him looking like a terrified, lost child. He suddenly painfully realized that without the skilled, dedicated union workers, the entire massive company was absolutely nothing but a useless, empty pile of incredibly expensive dirt. Every single passing day of the massive, coordinated, unbreakable strike would instantly, automatically trigger millions of dollars in severe, punishing construction delay penalties and brutal, catastrophic breach of contract lawsuits from their wealthy, absolutely furious investors. The massive hijacked corporate bank accounts would be drained within a few short weeks. Camille frantically grabbed onto her arrogant young lover, her eyes wide with sheer cold panic. They both realized they were standing on the deck of a rapidly sinking luxury ship with no functional lifeboats anywhere in sight. They hastily retreated to a quiet, dark, secluded corner, desperate to quickly find an escape route. They definitely could not beat the powerful unions, and they could not afford the massive daily fines. Facing millions in penalties, they decided to sell the entire company to massive venture capital firm Blackwood Capital for $200 million cash out. The ink on the forged federal land deed was barely dry before Chloe began aggressively spending the massive imaginary fortune she firmly believed was coming her way. My white daughter-in-law had always possessed an insatiable, terrifying appetite for unearned luxury, and the sudden prospect of a $200 million corporate buyout completely destroyed whatever tiny shred of financial restraint she had left in her soul. She did not wait for the massive venture capital firm to officially sign the final acquisition papers. She did not wait for the enormous sum of cash to actually clear the compromised corporate bank accounts. She immediately marched straight into the most exclusive, high-end private banking institutions in the city, wielding the forged federal land deed like an absolute golden ticket. She brazenly used my stolen, highly valuable downtown real estate as direct collateral to open massive new lines of unsecured personal credit. In a single reckless afternoon of blinding greed, Chloe purchased a completely ridiculous 60-foot luxury yacht that she demanded be docked exclusively at the Premier City Marina. She did not stop there. She quickly signed a staggering multi-million-dollar contract for a premium elite private jet membership, completely determined to permanently elevate her social status above the snobby bankrupt parents who had raised her. She walked through the high-end luxury boutiques of the city, swiping her heavy black metal credit cards with absolute wild abandon, purchasing flawless diamond necklaces, imported designer handbags, and custom-tailored silk dresses. She truly believed she had masterfully outsmarted everyone. She thought her weak, cowardly husband had successfully secured their lavish future by simply copying my signature onto a piece of paper. She was entirely, completely blinded by the blinding, dazzling light of her own unearned wealth. She never once stopped to consider the absolute terrifying reality of the massive, catastrophic federal crime she had forced Kendrick to commit. While Chloe was busy drowning herself in massive mountains of unsecured luxury debt, Darius and Camille were frantically, desperately trying to sell the sinking ship of Apex Development. The massive citywide union strike had completely paralyzed every single active construction site, pushing the hijacked company dangerously close to the edge of total absolute bankruptcy. They urgently needed a massive, immediate cash bailout before the angry investors discovered the terrible truth. They had hastily arranged a desperate, high-stakes meeting with the senior executive board of Blackwood Capital. Blackwood was a massive, ruthless global venture capital firm known for aggressively swallowing up struggling local companies and stripping them down for their highly valuable underlying assets. At exactly 10 in the morning, a fleet of sleek black luxury cars pulled up to the glass doors of my corporate headquarters. A team of sharp, aggressive corporate executives stepped out wearing expensive tailored suits and carrying thick leather briefcases. Darius was waiting for them in my massive corner office, sweating nervously through his designer shirt. He had ordered the frantic administrative staff to prepare a flashy, glossy presentation filled with colorful charts and empty corporate buzzwords. When the stern, intimidating executives took their seats around my heavy mahogany conference table, Darius proudly began his desperate sales pitch. He shamelessly, boldly took absolute full credit for every single massive achievement of my entire 40-year career. He pointed to the towering, impressive skyscrapers I had built with my own calloused hands and smoothly claimed they were the direct result of his brilliant modern strategic vision. He completely ignored the 400 loyal union workers who were currently striking outside his window. He aggressively sold the absolute lie that Apex Development was a perfectly healthy, highly profitable machine that only needed a small injection of corporate capital to reach the next level of global success. He smiled his bright, charismatic smile, trying desperately to charm the cold, calculating men sitting across the table. Darius and Camille falsely believed they were conducting a brilliant, secretive corporate negotiation entirely behind closed doors. They had absolutely no idea that I was parked directly across the busy city street, sitting quietly in the back of a heavily tinted, blacked-out security vehicle. I watched intently through the dark tinted glass as the powerful Blackwood Capital executives confidently marched through the heavy revolving doors of my corporate building. I did not feel angry. I did not feel a single ounce of panic or fear. As I watched the ruthless venture capitalists enter the very lobby I had personally designed, I leaned back against the plush leather seat, and a slow, cold smile spread across my face. I remembered the exact day I secretly, quietly purchased a controlling majority stake in Blackwood Capital through an invisible offshore holding company over 5 years ago. I had always known that the commercial real estate industry was filled with greedy, dangerous sharks. So I deliberately, quietly bought the biggest, deadliest shark in the entire ocean, just in case I ever needed it. I was sitting in the cold shadows watching my treacherous wife and her arrogant young lover desperately try to sell my own stolen company directly back to me. They were aggressively pitching my lifetime of hard work to executives who secretly answered exclusively to my private burner phone. I watched the windows of my corner office from across the street, perfectly imagining the nervous sweat dripping down Kendrick's pale face as he handed the forged federal land deeds over to the Blackwood lawyers. They were willingly, happily wrapping the thick, heavy rope tightly around their own necks, entirely convinced that it was a golden lifeline. I took a slow, deep breath of the cool, filtered air inside the vehicle, savoring the sweet, intoxicating absolute certainty of their impending catastrophic destruction. The massive, inescapable steel trap I had meticulously built was finally snapping completely shut. Inside the tense, quiet corporate boardroom, the lead chief executive officer of Blackwood Capital sat perfectly still, listening patiently to the empty, pathetic lies spilling from the mouth of Darius. The Blackwood executive was a brilliant, hardened veteran of corporate warfare who already knew the absolute, undeniable truth about the forged documents and the illegitimate hostile medical takeover. He had received his strict, absolute marching orders directly from my lawyer, Sterling, late last night. When Darius finally nervously concluded his flashy, desperate presentation, the large room fell completely, entirely silent. The Blackwood executive slowly closed his thick leather notebook and looked directly at Camille, Kendrick, and Darius. He told them in a cold, flat, professional voice that the venture capital firm was extremely highly interested in the massive portfolio. He officially formally agreed to the staggering $200 million purchase price without a single moment of standard aggressive negotiation. Camille let out a sharp, loud gasp of pure, unadulterated joy. Immediately grabbing Darius by the arm, Kendrick slumped back in his leather chair, exhaling a massive, heavy breath of profound, absolute relief. They truly, deeply believed they had just successfully executed the greatest corporate heist in the history of the city. They thought they had finally permanently escaped the massive, disastrous consequences of the union strike and the forged federal documents. They were already completely eagerly dreaming of their new, luxurious, wealthy lives. But the stern Blackwood executive suddenly sharply raised his hand, demanding absolute, total silence in the room. He leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on my mahogany table. He stated firmly that there was one final, non-negotiable condition to the massive $200 million acquisition. He absolutely refused to sign the final binding financial contracts in a quiet, private corporate boardroom. He demanded a massive, highly public signing ceremony to officially, formally finalize the transfer of the master land deeds. He insisted that the formal acquisition required the absolute highest level of public industry visibility to reassure the nervous, wealthy commercial investors. He mandated that the final legal signatures must be executed live on stage at the upcoming, highly anticipated annual commercial real estate industry gala at the end of the week. He told them that all the top city officials, the premier banking executives, and the elite local media would be present to witness the historic, massive transaction. Camille and Darius immediately eagerly agreed, completely entirely blinded by the blinding promise of the massive $200 million payout. They eagerly, aggressively shook the executive's hand, falsely believing they were stepping into the absolute brightest spotlight of their entire lives. They had absolutely no idea that the bright, flashing spotlight they were so eagerly chasing was actually the blinding headlight of a massive, speeding freight train. They were happily, proudly scheduling their own highly public, catastrophic execution in front of the entire wealthy city elite. I sat quietly in the dark SUV directly across the street, watching the Blackwood executives finally exit the building and enter their waiting vehicles. I smiled coldly into the deep shadows, knowing that the final spectacular stage for their ultimate absolute destruction was perfectly, securely, and permanently set. The night of the annual Commercial Real Estate Industry Gala finally arrived, covering the city in a thick blanket of freezing rain and blinding arrogance. The massive grand ballroom of the premier luxury hotel downtown was completely filled to absolute capacity with the wealthy elite of the entire city. The air was incredibly thick with the heavy scent of expensive imported perfumes and the quiet, arrogant hum of million-dollar conversations. Standing right in the very center of the spectacular, sparkling room was my treacherous wife, Camille. She was happily wearing the incredibly expensive custom diamond necklace I had personally bought for her on the exact day I discovered her unforgivable affair. She wore it proudly like a glowing golden trophy, completely, entirely oblivious to the massive, crushing weight of the catastrophic trap rapidly closing around her neck. Standing right next to her was Chloe, my greedy, manipulative white daughter-in-law. Chloe was dripping in massive diamonds and incredibly expensive designer silk. Every gemstone and tailored thread on her body was purchased on massive lines of fraudulent credit. She had brazenly, blindly used my forged federal land deeds as personal collateral to fund her completely ridiculous fake aristocratic lifestyle. She was laughing loudly, holding a crystal glass of imported champagne, entirely convinced that she was the absolute reigning queen of the wealthy high society world. She looked down on everyone in the massive room, secretly believing her fake blue blood lineage made her infinitely superior to the hard-working people who actually built the city. Kendrick was standing nervously, slightly behind his dominant wife, sweating profusely inside his perfectly tailored, expensive tuxedo. He kept nervously glancing around the massive, crowded room, completely terrified that the federal authorities were going to suddenly burst through the heavy wooden doors and drag him away in cold steel handcuffs. But Chloe simply aggressively patted his trembling arm and harshly whispered for him to act like a powerful, confident man for once in his pathetic, cowardly life. At the very front of the massive luxury ballroom, a spectacular wide stage had been meticulously constructed for the highly anticipated historic corporate signing ceremony. A massive mahogany desk sat directly in the center of the stage, illuminated by glowing theatrical spotlights. Sitting calmly behind the massive desk was the stern, ruthless chief executive officer of Blackwood Capital. He was wearing a sharp, dark suit and looking out over the massive crowd with cold, absolute calculating precision. He was patiently waiting for the massive corporate slaughter to officially begin. Darius was standing proudly next to the massive stage, soaking in the bright, flashing camera lights of the local financial media. He was wearing a ridiculously expensive, custom-tailored velvet tuxedo that I had definitely unknowingly paid for with my hijacked corporate bank accounts. He was smiling his bright, arrogant smile, shaking hands with prominent city officials and powerful banking executives. He was proudly taking absolute full credit for every towering commercial skyscraper I had painfully built with my own calloused, heavily scarred hands. He loudly told a group of wealthy, fascinated investors that his brilliant modern strategic vision was the sole absolute reason the massive $200 million acquisition was successfully happening tonight. He completely casually ignored the massive, devastating citywide union strike that was currently paralyzing every single active construction site in the entire metropolitan area. He firmly, blindly believed that signing the final formal acquisition papers tonight would instantly magically solve every single massive financial problem his breathtaking incompetence had rapidly created. The room began to slowly quiet down as the elegant, sophisticated master of ceremonies formally asked the wealthy elite crowd to direct their absolute full attention to the bright stage. The master of ceremonies loudly, proudly announced the historic, massive formal transfer of Apex Development to the giant global venture capital firm. The massive, wealthy crowd erupted into loud, polite, sophisticated applause as Darius began to slowly, confidently walk up the short wooden stairs to the brightly lit stage. He was proudly carrying the forged land deeds inside a thick leather folder, ready to hand over my entire life work to a massive, faceless corporate entity. He strutted arrogantly across the massive stage and confidently approached the heavy mahogany desk where the Blackwood chief executive officer was patiently, silently waiting. I was not watching this massive, infuriating spectacle on a small television screen in a cheap, dirty motel room. I was standing perfectly still in the dark shadows of the grand foyer just outside the thick, heavy wooden doors of the luxury ballroom. I was wearing a perfectly tailored, expensive dark wool suit that commanded absolute immediate respect, but I was not wearing expensive, polished Italian leather dress shoes. I was wearing my old, heavy, cement-stained, steel-toed work boots. They were the exact same heavy boots I wore 40 years ago when I was pouring freezing wet concrete and carrying massive steel beams on my bruised, bleeding shoulders. I wore them tonight as a deliberate, powerful reminder of exactly who I truly was and exactly how I had built my massive commercial empire from the dirty, frozen ground up. I stood in the dark, quiet foyer and remembered a very cold, harsh winter night in 1975. I had tried to walk into this very same luxury hotel to attend a public commercial real estate seminar. The arrogant white hotel manager had aggressively immediately blocked my path, completely refusing to let me enter the building simply because of the dark color of my skin. He told me aggressively that men who looked like me and wore dirty work boots did not belong in a luxury establishment. I was violently thrown out into the freezing, bitter snow with absolutely nothing but my raw, burning pride and a fierce, relentless, primitive determination to conquer the entire city. Tonight, I did not need to ask for permission to enter the massive building. Tonight, I owned the entire room. I reached out with my large, calloused hands and grabbed the heavy, ornate brass handles of the massive, grand ballroom doors. I pushed them open with a sudden, violent, massive surge of absolute, unstoppable strength. The heavy wooden doors slammed aggressively against the interior walls, creating a deafening boom that instantly echoed across the silent ballroom. The loud, polite applause instantly died. Every single head in the massive, crowded room simultaneously turned to look directly at the back entrance. The bright, flashing camera lights suddenly abruptly stopped. I stepped slowly, purposefully out of the dark, heavy shadows and into the bright, glowing light of the massive luxury ballroom. I walked with a slow, heavy, deliberate, absolute rhythm. The heavy steel toes of my old cement-stained work boots hit the polished hardwood floor with a loud, solid, terrifying thud that echoed in the absolute dead silence. Thud. 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 The wealthy crowd of elite, disconnected socialites automatically parted like the Red Sea as I walked straight down the center aisle. They pulled their expensive silk dresses and tailored suits away from me, staring in absolute terrified shock at the large, imposing 73-year-old black man invading their perfect, wealthy sanctuary. I did not look to the left or the right. I kept my cold, hard eyes completely locked directly on the bright stage. Camille saw me, and her expensive crystal champagne glass slipped through her trembling fingers, shattering violently on the floor. Her face turned an absolute, sickly, terrifying shade of pale ghost white. Darius froze completely, entirely stiff on the brightly lit stage, his arrogant, charismatic smile instantly melting into a mask of pure, unadulterated, cold terror. He looked like a frightened, weak little boy caught stealing from a giant. Chloe panicked completely, entirely losing her fake blue blood, aristocratic composure. She violently grabbed Kendrick's trembling arm and frantically began to scream loudly at the top of her lungs. She pointed her finger aggressively at me, her voice cracking with sheer, absolute, desperate panic. She screamed wildly for the armed private security guards to remove the crazy, dangerous old man from the luxury building. She yelled loudly that I was severely mentally unstable and a violent, direct threat to the massive, historic corporate signing ceremony. 3 massive, armed private security guards immediately began to aggressively rush toward me from the dark corners of the massive ballroom, reaching for the heavy tactical batons on their utility belts. But before they could take another single aggressive step, the stern, ruthless chief executive officer of Blackwood Capital suddenly stood up from behind the heavy mahogany desk. He raised his hand high into the bright, glowing theatrical spotlight, his voice echoing powerfully across the massive, silent room. He ordered the massive armed security guards to immediately back off and stand completely, entirely down. He looked directly at Chloe and Darius, his eyes burning with absolute, cold, corporate contempt. "Show some respect," he said, his voice booming with absolute, undeniable authority. "He is my boss." The entire luxury ballroom went completely dead silent. The sharp echo of my heavy steel-toed work boots hitting the polished hardwood floor was the only sound in the space. The wealthy elite crowd of socialites and powerful banking executives held their collective breath, staring in terrified shock. The stern chief executive officer of Blackwood Capital stepped respectfully aside, bowing his head slightly as I approached the mahogany desk. He did not look at Darius. He did not look at my treacherous wife, Camille. He only looked at me. I walked slowly, purposefully up the short wooden stairs to the brightly lit stage. I did not rush. I wanted every single person in that room to feel the crushing weight of my authority. Darius was frozen, completely stiff, his arrogant, charismatic smile erased from his pale, sweating face. I stepped up to the microphone, gripping the smooth wooden edges of the podium with my large, calloused, scarred hands. I looked out over the sea of expensive silk dresses and custom-tailored suits. I saw Chloe and Kendrick standing near the front row, shivering with pure, cold terror. I leaned into the microphone, my deep, gravelly voice echoing powerfully across the ballroom. "Good evening, everyone," I said, slowly, savoring the heavy tension in the room. I apologize for arriving late to this historic corporate signing ceremony, but I had to make sure my heavy work boots were tied correctly. A few chuckles rippled through the wealthy crowd, but they quickly died under my cold, hard gaze. I turned my head slowly and looked directly at Darius, who was trembling inside his ridiculously expensive custom velvet tuxedo. "You threw a beautiful, extravagant party using my hijacked corporate bank accounts, Darius," I said, my voice dripping with contempt. "You wore my expensive clothes, drank my rare vintage champagne, and proudly stood on this stage taking absolute full credit for 40 years of my relentless, brutal blood and sweat. You boldly promised these wealthy investors that your brilliant modern strategic vision was going to elevate my commercial real estate empire to unprecedented global success. But you fundamentally failed to understand the complex, invisible architecture of the massive mountain you arrogantly attempted to climb and steal from me." I turned my attention back to the captivated audience. For the past few weeks, my family has pushed a public narrative claiming that I am a severely mentally unstable old man suffering from dementia, I told the silent crowd. They claimed I was unfit to manage the massive $150 million commercial real estate empire I built from the freezing, dirty ground up. They excitedly invited all of you here tonight to witness the grand formal acquisition of Apex Development by the massive global venture capital firm known as Blackwood Capital. They promised you a seamless, highly profitable transition of immense corporate wealth and physical assets. I gestured calmly toward the stern chief executive officer standing quietly, respectfully behind me. But what my greedy, treacherous wife and my weak, cowardly son fundamentally failed to research is the actual hidden ownership structure of Blackwood Capital. The wealthy banking executives in the front row suddenly leaned forward, their eyes wide with sharp, intense curiosity and growing financial panic. Chloe began to aggressively shake her head, her face turning a sickly, terrifying shade of pale ghost white. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the heavy silence build before dropping the catastrophic hammer. 5 years ago, I secretly purchased a controlling 51% majority stake in Blackwood Capital through an invisible offshore holding company. I announced, my voice booming with absolute, undeniable finality. I am the sole majority owner and the supreme operating authority of the very same global venture capital firm standing on this stage tonight. The entire luxury ballroom erupted into a sudden massive wave of loud, frantic, panicked whispers. The wealthy elite investors quickly realized the staggering, devastating implications of my words. The ruthless corporate shark that was supposedly eagerly buying my struggling hijacked company was actually entirely secretly controlled by my own private burner phone. Darius stumbled backward away from the heavy mahogany desk, his knees buckling weakly under the crushing astronomical weight of the horrifying revelation. He looked wildly, frantically at the Blackwood chief executive officer, begging silently for a denial, but the stern veteran executive simply stared back at him with cold, professional indifference. Camille let out a sharp gasp, clutching her expensive custom diamond necklace in pure, raw terror. "You must be wondering why a supposed mentally unfit old man would secretly purchase a massive, ruthless venture capital firm?" I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly whisper that carried easily through the advanced audio system. I did it because I have always known the exact, true nature of my own family. I spent 4 decades building a massive fortune, pouring freezing wet concrete, and fighting corrupt city politicians while you slept peacefully in a luxurious suburban mansion. I gave you absolutely everything. I gave you unlimited wealth, premium elite educations, and unparalleled social status. But instead of building character and deep, unwavering loyalty, that massive, unearned luxury only bred intense, toxic greed and profound, disgusting arrogance. I always secretly, deeply knew that my son Kendrick was a weak, cowardly boy, entirely easily manipulated by anyone with a stronger, vicious will. I always clearly saw the cold, calculated hunger burning brightly in the eyes of his arrogant, manipulative white wife, Chloe. And I always intimately knew that Camille only truly loved the bright, shiny reflection of her own status in my heavy wallet. I built Blackwood Capital as a massive, invisible financial trapdoor specifically designed for this exact terrifying scenario I explained to the horrified crowd. I constructed a hidden, fail-safe mechanism buried so deeply under complex layers of anonymous corporate trusts that nobody could ever possibly find the bottom. I knew that if my family ever foolishly attempted to violently overthrow me and steal my massive life work, they would inevitably rapidly run the entire successful company straight into the ground. I knew their greed would quickly force them to seek a massive, immediate cash bailout from a giant corporate entity. I just made absolutely certain that I owned the biggest, deadliest shark in the entire financial ocean. I set the perfect, irresistible bait, and I waited patiently in the dark, cold shadows, while you willingly, happily wrapped the thick, heavy rope tightly around your own treacherous necks. You actually honestly believed you had masterfully, brilliantly outsmarted a senile, broken old man. You thought locking me out of my own private $15 million estate and throwing my luggage into the wet dirt would easily break my primitive survival spirit. I locked my cold, hard eyes directly onto Chloe. She was visibly shaking her pristine white designer coat, suddenly looking like a cheap, highly inappropriate costume. You sat in my filthy cheap $40 a night motel room and arrogantly offered me a pathetic $3,000 monthly allowance from my own massive corporate bank accounts. I said, my voice slicing through the heavy, tense air like a sharp steel blade. You brutally insulted my entire legacy, calling my lifetime of hard, relentless labor nothing but useless dirt and concrete. You brazenly used the highly valuable downtown real estate I built to open massive unsecured lines of personal credit, purchasing a completely ridiculous 60-foot luxury yacht and elite private jet memberships. You truly deeply believed your fake blue blood aristocratic lineage made you infinitely superior to the hard-working black men who actually physically built this beautiful city. But you completely failed to realize that the dirt and concrete you so casually despised is the exact same heavy material that is currently rapidly burying you alive. The local financial media cameras suddenly began flashing wildly, capturing every single devastating word. I turned my gaze away from the ruined daughter-in-law and looked directly at Darius Kendrick and Camille. They were standing frozen, trapped in the blinding headlights of a massive, speeding freight train they could no longer possibly avoid. The thick leather folder containing the formal acquisition papers was resting heavily on the mahogany desk right in front of Darius. I pointed my large, calloused finger directly at the thick stack of legal documents. I want everyone in this massive luxury room to clearly understand exactly what is happening here tonight. I declared, my voice ringing with absolute devastating authority. You are not celebrating a brilliant modern corporate merger. You are not successfully escaping the catastrophic financial consequences of the citywide union strike you foolishly provoked. I leaned forward, resting my heavy hands against the wooden podium. I looked at Camille Kendrick and Chloe, staring straight into their wide eyes. You are not selling my company to a venture capital firm, I said, delivering the ultimate fatal blow. You are attempting to sell a stolen company back to me using forged federal land deeds. The realization hit Kendrick like a massive speeding freight train crashing directly into a fragile glass wall. He stood frozen at the edge of the stage, his mind finally grasping the absolute catastrophic magnitude of the massive legal trap he had willingly walked into. The forged federal land deeds were sitting completely exposed inside the thick leather folder resting heavily on the mahogany desk right in front of Darius. Kendrick suddenly broke his terrified paralysis and lunged forward with a wild, desperate scream. He frantically scrambled up the short wooden stairs, his expensive tailored tuxedo tearing at the seams as he desperately tried to snatch the fraudulent paperwork off the wooden podium. He falsely believed that if he could just grab the physical documents and destroy them, he could somehow magically erase the severe federal felony he had committed. But before his trembling, sweating hands could even touch the thick leather folder, the heavy velvet curtains behind the stage violently parted. Two tall, heavily built Federal Bureau of Investigation agents stepped swiftly out of the dark shadows, wearing sharp dark suits and stern, unyielding expressions. They moved with absolute terrifying speed and precise tactical efficiency. One agent aggressively slammed his heavy hand down onto the leather folder permanently securing the highly illegal forged documents, while the other agent forcefully shoved Kendrick backward, causing my cowardly son to stumble and collapse heavily onto the polished hardwood stage floor. The wealthy elite crowd gasped loudly in pure shock, watching the powerful federal government officially directly intervene in the massive corporate spectacle. Kendrick scrambled backward on his hands and knees, entirely consumed by raw, suffocating panic as he stared up at the towering federal agents. The trap was finally perfectly, completely, and permanently shut, firmly locking him inside forever without any escape. As Kendrick cowered pathetically on the bright stage, a tall, slender man in a sharp charcoal suit calmly walked up the wooden steps. It was Sterling, my ruthless, disbarred corporate fixer and trusted legal strategist. Sterling did not look at the terrified socialites or the flashing media cameras. He stepped directly up to the microphone, replacing me at the heavy wooden podium. He pulled a small digital audio device from his suit pocket and connected it seamlessly to the advanced sound system of the massive luxury ballroom. Sterling looked down at Chloe, who was hyperventilating near the front row, clutching her fraudulent diamond necklace in sheer, absolute terror. He pressed a single button on the digital device, and a crystal-clear, high-definition audio recording echoed powerfully across the silent, terrified room. The audio was undeniably perfect, capturing every single sinister whisper with absolute chilling clarity. The entire wealthy crowd listened in sheer, absolute horror as Chloe's venomous, arrogant voice filled the massive room. The recording played the exact terrifying moment she aggressively forced my weak, trembling son to forge my signature. Everyone heard her brutally insult his manhood, calling him a pathetic, cowardly failure. Everyone heard her explicitly directly command him to pick up a black pen and sign my name on the bottom of the master deed to save their stolen corporate empire. The crystal-clear audio left absolutely no room for doubt or misinterpretation. It was the undeniable smoking gun of a massive coordinated federal wire fraud and illegal real estate extortion scheme. The wealthy banking executives who had previously proudly courted Chloe and Kendrick now stared at them with profound, total disgust and immediate intense legal panic, completely terrified of being associated with federal felons facing massive mandatory prison sentences and total, absolute, permanent financial ruin. Chloe stumbled backward, her pristine white designer coat suddenly feeling like a heavy, suffocating straitjacket. She stared wildly at the towering ceiling speakers, completely unable to comprehend how her most private, secretive conversation had been perfectly recorded and broadcast to the entire wealthy city elite. She had entirely failed to realize that the sprawling $4 million suburban mansion I had generously purchased for them was completely legally owned by my private trusts. I had personally designed and installed the state-of-the-art security system in that massive house, and I never once surrendered the master administrative access codes. I had been quietly, patiently monitoring the high-definition security cameras and hidden audio microphones for several years, listening closely to everything that happened under my roof. I heard every single highly offensive racist insult Chloe made when she falsely believed nobody was listening. I heard her constantly mock our hard-earned black wealth as loud, unsophisticated new money, while aggressively spending every single dime I provided. I listened to her repeatedly complain about the smell of my hard-working, loyal construction foreman, and I heard her deeply venomous plans to eventually lock me away in a state facility long before she actually executed the brutal medical coup. I knew exactly who she truly was at her dark, rotten core. I allowed her to happily, comfortably live inside my expensive, luxurious walls, while she plotted my ultimate demise, completely unaware that the very house she lived in was actually a massive invisible cage recording her every single federal crime. The arrogant white daughter-in-law, who always falsely claimed absolute aristocratic superiority, had just been spectacularly, completely destroyed by the precise technology installed by an uneducated old black bricklayer. She constantly deeply despised and underestimated her entire pathetic life. The devastating audio recording finally stopped, leaving a thick, heavy, suffocating silence lingering over the massive grand ballroom. The The two Federal Bureau of Investigation agents standing on the brightly lit stage simultaneously reached around to the back of their dark suit belts. The sharp, chilling metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs being rapidly unpouched echoed loudly across the completely paralyzed crowd. The agents stepped aggressively toward Kendrick, who was still cowering on the hardwood floor, openly weeping like a terrified, broken child. The reality of spending the next 20 years rotting inside a maximum security federal penitentiary had completely, utterly shattered his fragile, pathetic mind. Camille stood completely frozen near the massive stage, her expensive, imported champagne soaking into the expensive carpet at her trembling feet. She looked frantically, desperately toward her young, handsome lover, hoping he would step forward and protect her from the catastrophic legal apocalypse unfolding right before their horrified eyes. She truly, deeply believed that Darius possessed the masculine strength and corporate power to magically fix the absolute terrifying disaster. But Darius was not a strong, loyal man who would bravely stand and fight for the aging woman who had foolishly entirely funded his luxurious, arrogant lifestyle. The exact second the federal agents produced the heavy steel handcuffs, Darius immediately instinctively reverted to his true, cowardly nature. He slowly, silently took a step backward away from the brightly lit stage, melting quickly into the terrified, chaotic crowd of wealthy elite socialites. He completely, entirely abandoned my treacherous wife without a single backward glance or a whispered apology. He aggressively pushed his way through the dense, panicked crowd of expensive silk dresses and tailored suits, desperately sprinting toward the heavy wooden back doors of the grand luxury ballroom, hoping to completely, entirely escape the massive venue unseen. I watched Darius frantically sprinting toward the distant exit, his expensive custom velvet tuxedo looking like a ridiculous joke on his fleeing, cowardly frame. He falsely believed he could simply sneak out the back door and disappear entirely into the dark, cold city night, leaving my foolish wife and my broken son to absorb the catastrophic federal punishment all alone. He thought he was fast and clever, but he was running straight into a secondary trap that I had meticulously prepared long before I even stepped into the luxury hotel lobby. He aggressively reached out to push open the heavy, ornate wooden doors, expecting to find the quiet, empty, carpeted hallways leading to the grand hotel elevators. But the massive ballroom doors did not open freely. They were being held firmly, tightly shut from the outside. The wealthy elite guests watched in absolute stunned silence as Darius desperately, violently threw his entire body weight against the heavy wood, his face contorted in sheer, raw, animalistic panic. He screamed loudly, begging the invisible people on the other side to open the massive doors and let him out into the lobby. I stood calmly on the brightly lit stage, watching the young interior designer absolutely humiliate himself in front of the most powerful people in the entire city. Camille finally realized she had been totally abandoned by the man she had destroyed our 40-year marriage to protect. She collapsed onto her knees, clutching her diamond necklace and sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. The massive, brilliant corporate coup had officially, spectacularly ended in absolute, undeniable ruin. The greedy, treacherous traitors who had plotted to steal my commercial empire were now completely trapped inside a massive luxury cage, waiting for the final, absolute, devastating blow to permanently seal their dark, miserable fate forever. Darius threw his entire body weight against the heavy wooden doors of the grand luxury ballroom, hoping to escape the massive legal apocalypse unnoticed. He aggressively grabbed the ornate brass handles, pulling and pushing with sheer, raw, animalistic panic, but the thick doors refused to open even a single inch. He could hear the heavy silence of the wealthy elite crowd standing right behind him, watching his pathetic, cowardly display of absolute terror. He falsely believed that the hotel security had locked the doors to protect the high society guests from the sudden chaos unfolding on the brightly lit stage. He slammed his fists desperately against the solid wood, screaming loudly for someone to let him out into the quiet, empty, carpeted hallways of the luxury hotel. He thought he was a clever, agile shark who could simply swim away from the massive, catastrophic mess he had eagerly helped create. But the invisible force holding the heavy doors tightly shut from the outside was not the hotel security team. The large wooden doors suddenly violently swung inward, knocking Darius completely off his feet and sending him sprawling onto the expensive carpet. Standing in the brightly lit doorway were 20 massive, highly skilled union workers wearing their heavy denim jackets and mud-stained steel-toed boots. They were the exact same veteran foremen and skilled professional laborers that Darius had arrogantly, callously fired just a few days ago to aggressively cut corporate costs. Marcus, my oldest and most incredibly loyal black foreman, stepped slowly over the threshold, staring down at the terrified young interior designer with absolute, pure, unadulterated disgust. The union workers had not gone home after shutting down the commercial job sites across the sprawling city. They had marched directly to the luxury hotel to proudly witness my victory. Marcus reached down with his massive calloused hands and grabbed the lapels of the expensive custom velvet tuxedo. He effortlessly hoisted Darius off the carpeted floor, dragging him aggressively back into the center of the massive luxury ballroom. The wealthy elite guests scrambled hastily out of the way, completely horrified by the sudden physical arrival of the hardened working-class men. Darius kicked and thrashed wildly, screaming loudly for someone to intervene, but the powerful union workers formed a solid, impenetrable wall behind him. They pushed him forcefully toward the brightly lit stage, where the 2 Federal Bureau of Investigation agents were patiently waiting with heavy steel handcuffs. Darius stumbled forward, his face completely devoid of any remaining color, staring blindly at the cold, severe federal authorities. He realized instantly that his pathetic, desperate attempt to quietly escape into the dark, cold night had completely failed for all eternity. Faced with the absolute, undeniable reality of massive federal wire fraud charges, Darius completely lost whatever tiny shred of fake masculine bravado he had left. He knew that the federal agents possessed the forged land deeds and the crystal-clear audio recording directly linking the stolen company to the illegal takeover. The sheer terrifying thought of spending decades wearing a bright orange jumpsuit inside a cold, maximum security prison cell absolutely shattered his fragile mind. He aggressively, desperately turned away from the towering federal agents and pointed a trembling finger directly at my kneeling, weeping wife. He did not act like a strong, protective lover, willing to heroically sacrifice his own freedom for the beautiful woman who had blindly, entirely funded his arrogant lifestyle. He instantly violently transformed into a pathetic, cornered rat willing to ruthlessly betray anyone to completely save his own worthless, miserable skin from the severe punishment. It was all her sinister idea, Darius screamed loudly, his voice cracking hysterically across the silent, massive ballroom. He gestured aggressively toward Camille, who was still clutching her expensive custom diamond necklace in absolute sheer terror. I did not want to steal any commercial property or forge any federal legal documents, he pleaded wildly, completely ignoring the massive crowd of wealthy, elite guests. She forced me to do it because she wanted absolute, total control of the incredibly massive corporate fortune. She is nothing but a desperate, aging sugar mama who aggressively bought my deep affections with her stolen luxury credit cards. He loudly, brutally continued his frantic, cowardly tirade, desperately trying to completely shift the entire heavy legal blame onto the 2 greedy women who had happily invited him into their dark, treacherous conspiracy. She promised me endless wealth if I just helped her permanently remove her old husband. Those brutally cruel, humiliating words hit my treacherous wife like a massive, heavy barrage of physical blows. I watched her face completely, entirely crumble into a pathetic expression of sheer, unadulterated, devastating agony. Camille had always harbored a deep, terrifying, profound fear of eventually losing her fading physical beauty and her elevated social status among the wealthy elite. She spent her entire adult life aggressively obsessing over expensive cosmetic surgeries, imported designer dresses, and the bright, shiny reflection of her own manufactured perfection. She completely abandoned our long 40-year marriage specifically because the young, handsome interior designer made her feel vibrant and desirable again. She was entirely willing to ruthlessly destroy my entire commercial legacy just to happily, securely fund her pathetic, desperate illusion of eternal youth. Hearing her chosen young lover publicly, brutally degrade her physical age completely shattered her fragile, vain identity into a million invisible pieces. She realized in that exact horrifying moment that Darius never truly loved her or respected her in any genuine, meaningful way. He had simply viewed her as a highly convenient, very wealthy stepping stone to rapidly, aggressively elevate his own mediocre, pathetic career. The entire high society crowd stared at her with absolute raw, unfiltered pity and deep, cold disgust. The wealthy elite peers she had always desperately tried to violently impress now saw her as nothing more than a foolish, gullible, aging woman who had been spectacularly played by a cheap common con artist. Camille slowly looked up at the brightly lit stage, searching my cold, hard face for any tiny remaining shred of past marital sympathy. But I offered her absolutely nothing. I simply stood behind the heavy mahogany desk, wearing my old cement-stained boots, watching her entire artificial, luxurious world violently, painfully burn to ashes completely. The two towering federal agents had heard absolutely enough of the pathetic, cowardly screaming. They stepped aggressively down from the brightly lit wooden stage, moving with absolute, undeniable tactical authority toward the broken, treacherous group. One agent violently grabbed Darius by his custom velvet shoulder, forcefully spinning him around and slamming him aggressively against a massive marble structural pillar. He pulled Darius' arms painfully tightly behind his back and expertly snapped the heavy cold steel handcuffs securely around his trembling wrists. Darius completely stopped his frantic, loud screaming, instantly melting into a pathetic weeping puddle of pure, absolute, unadulterated terror as his formal federal rights were aggressively, coldly read aloud to the entire silent ballroom. The second federal agent walked with absolute purpose toward my weak, cowardly son Kendrick. Kendrick did not try to run or fight back against the massive, severe, inevitable legal consequences of his own terrible greed. Kendrick simply obediently, slowly extended his pale, trembling hands forward, completely submitting to the heavy, cold steel cuffs. He looked absolutely, entirely ruined, his expensive tailored tuxedo now deeply wrinkled and soaked in his own terrified, nervous sweat. Camille was the absolute last traitor to be formally arrested by the severe federal authorities. She had to be forcefully, roughly pulled up from the expensive carpeted floor, her incredibly expensive custom diamond necklace swinging wildly, completely out of place against her ruined silk dress. As the cold steel cuffs clicked aggressively tightly around her delicate wrists, she let out a long, pathetic, devastating wail of pure, total despair. She finally fully realized that she had permanently, irreversibly lost her entire luxurious, comfortable life, her elevated, respected social standing, and her incredibly vast, immense stolen wealth in a single, massive, catastrophic evening. Her entire fake, aristocratic world was instantly, entirely destroyed completely. Chloe desperately, aggressively tried to completely, entirely distance herself from the massive, devastating federal disaster unfolding perfectly around her. As the federal agents forcefully, heavily escorted Kendrick toward the massive back doors, she began to loudly, frantically scream her pathetic, desperate, highly rehearsed lies. She falsely, desperately claimed that her weak, cowardly husband had physically, aggressively forced her to happily participate in the entire massive, illegal real estate scheme. She loudly begged the federal authorities to believe that she was nothing more than an innocent, terrified victim trapped entirely in a highly abusive, manipulative marriage. But her desperate, pathetic words rang completely, undeniably hollow against the crystal-clear audio recording everyone had just clearly heard. She was not a poor, innocent victim. She was the absolute, dark, sinister mastermind behind the entire, massive, fraudulent coup, and she was currently entirely, completely, utterly alone, trapped permanently in her own massive destruction. Chloe walked out of the heavy wooden doors of the grand luxury ballroom completely convinced she had successfully escaped the massive catastrophic disaster. She had played the innocent, terrified victim to absolute perfection, weeping loudly and aggressively, claiming her weak, cowardly husband had physically forced her to participate in the entire massive illegal real estate scheme. The federal agents had simply taken her formal statement and told her not to leave the city limits. She smoothed the front of her pristine white designer silk coat, her arrogant confidence rapidly returning to her pale face as she breathed the conditioned air. She truly believed that without Kendrick, she was entirely free to simply walk away from the massive, smoking wreckage of the hijacked corporate empire. She completely convinced herself that she still securely possessed the massive, unearned luxury assets she had fraudulently acquired earlier that exact same week. She strutted arrogantly through the opulent hotel lobby, her expensive designer heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floors, acting exactly like a reigning queen who had just survived a bloody peasant revolution. She handed her valet ticket to the attendant outside the freezing glass doors, wrapping her thick white coat tightly around. She wrapped her white coat tightly around her shoulders against the biting winter wind, eagerly anticipating climbing into the warm interior of her heavily financed premium vehicle. She planned to drive far away from the pathetic, embarrassing mess her foolish husband had completely created. But when the young valet pulled her sleek black luxury vehicle up to the brightly lit hotel entrance, Chloe quickly realized that her massive night of sheer terror was entirely far from over. Standing perfectly still next to the open driver's side door was a tall, severely dressed man wearing a sharp, immaculate dark gray suit. He held a thick, locked leather briefcase and did not look like a standard hotel employee or a wealthy, elite gala guest. He possessed the cold, calculating, emotionless posture of a high-level corporate financial executioner. Chloe cautiously, slowly approached her expensive vehicle, her heart beginning to pound violently heavily against her ribs once again. The stern, severe man politely held out his bare hand, completely blocking her from entering the warm driver's seat. He introduced himself with chilling, professional courtesy as a senior executive recovery agent directly representing the elite private luxury bank where Chloe had recently eagerly opened. She had recently eagerly opened her massive fraudulent lines of credit at that exact elite institution. He spoke in a flat, dead tone, entirely devoid of human empathy or basic compassion. He calmly, explicitly informed her that the elite banking institution had just received a highly urgent direct federal notification regarding the absolute invalidity of her primary financial collateral. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had officially flagged the master land transfer deed as a confirmed malicious forgery, entirely invalidating the massive financial foundation of her newly acquired, unearned wealth. The senior recovery agent opened his thick, heavy leather briefcase immediately. He pulled out a single, crisp piece of white paper, handing it directly to the trembling, arrogant daughter-in-law. It was not a polite, courteous warning or a standard monthly bank statement. It was a formal, absolute legal demand for immediate total financial restitution. The agent coldly explained that because the specific collateral she used to secure the massive loans was a proven federal forgery, the private bank was instantly aggressively calling in every single dime of her $15 million debt. The incredibly expensive 60-foot luxury yacht she proudly demanded be exclusively docked at the Premier City. The Premier City Marina was currently being aggressively seized by federal maritime authorities. The staggering multi-million-dollar contract for her premium elite private jet membership was entirely permanently revoked. Every flawless diamond necklace, imported designer handbag, and custom-tailored silk dress she had wildly purchased was now legally classified as fraudulently acquired stolen property. The stern recovery agent explicitly informed her that if she did not produce $15 million in verifiable liquid cash by the absolute start of the next business day, the private bank would ruthlessly initiate severe criminal fraud charges against her directly without hesitation entirely. He forcefully took the electronic key fob to her massive black luxury vehicle directly out of her trembling pale hands, stating firmly that the vehicle was officially formally repossessed, effective immediately. He turned around smoothly and drove her stolen luxury car away into the dark, cold night, leaving Chloe standing completely, entirely stranded on the freezing concrete pavement. Chloe stood completely alone in the freezing, bitter cold, her pristine white designer coat completely failing to protect her from the massive, freezing, harsh reality of her total, absolute, permanent financial ruin. She frantically, hastily pulled her expensive mobile phone out entirely. She pulled her expensive mobile phone out from her designer handbag, her delicate fingers trembling so violently she could barely unlock the bright glowing screen. She urgently dialed the private unlisted home number of her wealthy aristocratic parents, hoping they would quickly magically wire her the massive $15 million to permanently save her fake blue blood reputation. She listened to the phone ring heavily in the dark, freezing night, praying desperately for her snobby, arrogant father to answer and immediately rescue his perfect, entitled daughter from the massive, catastrophic disaster. When her father finally answered the phone, slowly speaking, his voice was not strong or authoritative as it usually sounded at their elite country club dinners. It was weak, pathetic, and trembling with his own massive, hidden, terrifying secrets. Chloe hysterically loudly begged him for a massive immediate cash bailout, crying wildly that she was going to be aggressively thrown into a cold, maximum security federal prison for massive wire fraud. But her arrogant father did not offer her a single penny or any warm paternal comfort. He brutally, painfully confessed the absolute devastating hidden truth that he had kept completely, entirely secret from the wealthy high society world. He had kept it a secret from the high society world for over a decade. He painfully admitted that their proud old money family was secretly, completely, entirely bankrupt. He squandered every single dime of their massive generational wealth on terrible failed investments and massive hidden gambling debts. He confessed that their massive, beautiful, sprawling estate was currently secretly heavily mortgaged and they were completely, entirely surviving on rapidly expiring credit cards. He bluntly told his sobbing, ruined daughter that she was completely, utterly on her own because they had absolutely nothing left to give her to save her life. Chloe dropped her expensive mobile phone onto the freezing concrete pavement, her entire artificial, luxurious world completely, instantly shattered into a million invisible, sharp pieces. She had absolutely no money, no powerful, wealthy husband, no rich, aristocratic family, and no safe, warm place to hide from the rapidly approaching legal apocalypse. She was a complete, absolute fraud, standing shivering in the freezing, bitter cold, completely, entirely stripped of her unearned fake superiority. As she stood weeping uncontrollably on the dark, freezing pavement, a large, heavy, black luxury sedan slowly, silently pulled out of the underground hotel parking garage directly nearby. It stopped directly in front of her trembling frame. The rear passenger window slowly, smoothly rolled down, completely revealing my cold, hard face, sitting quietly, peacefully in the dark shadows. I was wearing my old, cement-stained, steel-toed work boots, and looking directly at the ruined, arrogant white woman with pure, unadulterated cold indifference. Chloe saw my face, and a sudden, massive wave of sheer, absolute, desperate panic washed completely, entirely over her. She knew instantly I was the absolute only person left in the entire world who could possibly miraculously save her from total, absolute destruction today entirely. She completely, entirely abandoned all of her fake, aristocratic pride and her deeply toxic, unearned superiority. She took a desperate, stumbling step toward my heavy black vehicle and violently collapsed onto her bare knees. She fell heavily onto the freezing concrete pavement, directly into a massive, thick black puddle of dirty motor oil left behind by a passing commercial truck. The filthy, dark oil immediately soaked deeply into her pristine, expensive white designer silk coat, completely, permanently ruining the beautiful, luxurious fabric. She placed her trembling, freezing hands flat against the dirty, wet concrete and loudly, hysterically begged me completely. She loudly, hysterically begged me for total, unconditional mercy. She wept wildly, screaming that she was deeply, profoundly sorry for constantly, brutally insulting my hard-earned black wealth and dedicated, loyal construction workers. She frantically pleaded with me to pay her massive $15 million bank debt, promising she would completely disappear and never bother my family ever again. I looked down at the pathetic, broken, weeping woman kneeling in the filthy, dark oil, entirely ruined by her own massive, toxic, blinding greed. I simply, slowly rolled up my car window and calmly drove away into the freezing night completely. 3 months slowly passed since the massive, disastrous night at the luxury hotel ballroom. The freezing winter had finally thawed into a damp, bitter spring, but the heavy legal consequences of the corporate coup were only just beginning to bloom. I sat completely still on the hard wooden bench inside the sterile family courthouse. I was wearing a sharp, tailored, dark suit, my posture perfectly straight, and my calloused hands resting quietly on the polished wooden defense table. Sitting exactly 20 feet across the quiet courtroom at the plaintiff table was my treacherous, estranged wife, Camille. She was dressed in a simple, modest, dark gray dress, attempting to portray herself as a humble, heartbroken woman who had been deeply wronged by a cruel, powerful husband. She was actively, aggressively seeking a massive 50% split of my entire $150 million commercial real estate empire. In her official legal filings, she audaciously claimed that she had been a profoundly supportive, dedicated wife for over 4 decades. She demanded a staggering monthly alimony payment, arguing that she was legally entitled to easily maintain the luxurious, unearned lifestyle she had grown completely accustomed to enjoying entirely at my personal expense. Her highly paid, aggressive divorce attorney stood up confidently and began to deliver a loud, passionate opening statement to the stern, older female judge. He boldly, falsely painted Camille as a dedicated, long-suffering matriarch who had sacrificed her own youth and personal ambitions to quietly support my massive, demanding corporate career. He lied flawlessly, claiming that she had stood faithfully by my side during the early, brutal years of building Apex development, completely ignoring the factual reality that she never once lifted a single brick or stepped foot onto a dirty, freezing job site. The sleazy attorney loudly argued that my recent supposed erratic medical behavior and aggressive financial retaliation were clear, undeniable signs of a deeply cruel, vindictive man trying to unfairly punish his loyal wife. Camille pulled out a white lace handkerchief and carefully dabbed at her dry eyes, putting on a truly pathetic, highly rehearsed performance for the judge. She wanted the court to falsely believe she was entitled to half of my massive mountain simply because she had occasionally safely rested in its comfortable shade. She truly deeply believed that her 40 years of simply existing inside my expensive, luxurious mansion equated to actual, genuine physical labor and true marital sacrifice. I watched her fake, pathetic weeping, and I felt a sudden, powerful memory of my own late mother rush into my mind. My mother was a fierce, strong black woman who stayed deeply loyal to my father through periods of extreme, terrifying, crushing poverty. I vividly remembered being a young, hungry boy, watching my parents sit at a small, wobbly kitchen table under a single flickering light bulb. My father had tragically lost his manual labor job, and he was weeping silently out of pure, absolute shame because he could not provide enough warm food for his family. My mother did not scream at him or pack her bags to go find a wealthier man. She simply gently wrapped her strong arms around his shaking shoulders and told him that they would survive the bitter storm completely together. She took on 3 separate, exhausting cleaning jobs, scrubbing dirty floors on her bruised hands and knees just to keep a cheap roof over our heads. That was what true, absolute, unconditional marital loyalty actually looked like in the real, unforgiving world. I looked across the silent courtroom at Camille, and I realized with absolute cold clarity that she was never truly loyal to me as a human being. She was only ever fiercely, deeply loyal to my massive, heavy wallet and the unearned luxury it effortlessly provided her. When Camille's attorney finally sat down looking smug and thoroughly satisfied, my own legal counsel slowly, deliberately stood up. Sterling, the ruthless, disbarred corporate fixer who had recently successfully reclaimed his legal license just to aggressively destroy my treacherous family, walked calmly toward the center of the courtroom. He did not offer any passionate, emotional speeches or loud, dramatic, theatrical performances. He simply calmly opened a thick, heavy black leather binder and began systematically, completely dismantling Camille's entire fraudulent life. "Your Honor," Sterling said, his voice cold flat and entirely devoid of any human sympathy. The plaintiff claims she was a completely supportive, dedicated wife, but the massive, undeniable physical evidence tells a drastically different, sinister story. Sterling pulled out a massive stack of high-resolution photographs and handed them directly to the stern judge. The highly detailed photographs were taken by the private security team I had quietly hired months ago. They explicitly, clearly showed Camille engaged in highly intimate, deeply compromising romantic encounters with Darius, the arrogant interior designer. There were crystal clear images of them kissing passionately in the back of expensive luxury vehicles and walking hand in hand into expensive boutique hotels downtown during the exact same hours she falsely claimed to be working diligently at her interior design firm. Camille's face instantly turned a sickening shade of pale ghost white as the stern judge slowly reviewed the undeniable visual proof of her massive, repeated marital infidelity. But Sterling was absolutely, entirely far from finished completely destroying her fake innocent facade. He pulled out thick stacks of highly detailed corporate banking records and certified medical documents. He explicitly, calmly detailed exactly how Camille and Chloe had maliciously, aggressively conspired to commit severe medical gaslighting. He submitted formal legal affidavits from the actual private doctor they had illegally bribed, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that they had paid massive sums of stolen corporate money to falsely declare me mentally unfit. Sterling methodically, brutally exposed her massive, severe corporate sabotage. He clearly showed the judge the exact hidden offshore financial accounts where Camille had been secretly, slowly siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from the interior design firm to aggressively, blindly fund Darius and his lavish, ridiculous lifestyle. He proved completely that while she claimed to be a supportive, loving wife, she was actually acting as a massive, destructive parasite, intentionally, actively trying to illegally seize total, absolute control of a $150 million commercial real estate empire by permanently locking her completely sane, healthy husband inside a terrifying psychiatric facility. The heavy, silent tension inside the sterile family courtroom became absolutely, utterly suffocating. Camille's highly paid, aggressive divorce attorney sat completely, entirely frozen in his chair, realizing his entire massive, lucrative legal case had just been completely, instantly destroyed by undeniable federal evidence. He slowly slid his chair slightly away from Camille, silently professionally distancing himself from the massive, toxic, radioactive fallout of her severe, undeniable crimes. Camille was no longer dabbing her eyes with her delicate lace handkerchief. She was shaking violently, uncontrollably, staring wildly at the thick stack of damning evidence resting heavily on the judge's polished wooden bench. The stern female judge took off her reading glasses and looked directly down at Camille with pure, unadulterated, cold judicial disgust. The judge had spent decades presiding over messy, bitter family disputes, but she had clearly never witnessed such a massive, sinister, coordinated level of pure, absolute toxic greed and severe, malicious betrayal. The fake, pathetic illusion of the heartbroken, supportive wife was entirely, permanently, completely shattered into a million invisible sharp pieces right in front of the entire silent courtroom. Camille opened her mouth, trying desperately to stammer out a pathetic, weak excuse or another blatant lie, but the stern judge aggressively raised her heavy wooden gavel, demanding total, absolute, immediate silence. The judge leaned forward, her voice echoing loudly, powerfully, with absolute, undeniable legal authority across the tense, quiet room. "I have seen many cases of marital infidelity and financial disputes in my courtroom," the judge stated firmly. "But the severe, profound level of malicious, calculated fraud, corporate sabotage, and medical extortion displayed by the plaintiff in this specific case is absolutely unprecedented and entirely reprehensible. You did not just cheat on your husband. You actively, maliciously attempted to steal his entire lifelong legacy and permanently strip him of his basic human freedom for your own selfish, immense, unearned financial gain." The judge firmly, aggressively struck her wooden gavel against the sounding block, delivering the ultimate fatal legal blow. The petition for 50% of the marital assets is completely, entirely, explicitly denied with absolute extreme prejudice. Furthermore, due to the massive, undeniable, proven financial fraud and intentional, severe, malicious sabotage, the plaintiff is completely, entirely stripped of any and all claims to spousal support. You will receive exactly $0 in monthly alimony from Mr. Sterling. Finally, because this entire fraudulent, frivolous lawsuit was built entirely on massive, malicious lies and illegal extortion, you are officially, legally ordered to completely, entirely pay all of the defendant's massive legal fees and expensive court costs, effective immediately. Camille let out a loud, horrific, devastating wail of pure, absolute, total despair, realizing she was leaving the courtroom with absolutely nothing. The massive federal legal machine moved with absolute terrifying speed, completely crushing the greedy traitors who tried to steal my commercial real estate empire. My weak, cowardly son, Kendrick, managed to narrowly avoid a lengthy sentence in a maximum security federal prison, but he did not escape total, absolute devastation. When the federal prosecutors offered him a strict plea deal, he immediately folded. He eagerly agreed to officially testify against his manipulative white wife, Chloe, and the arrogant interior designer, Darius. He sat in a cold, sterile federal interrogation room and sang like a terrified canary, completely detailing every single malicious step of their massive corporate fraud and illegal real estate extortion scheme. He traded his absolute loyalty for his physical freedom, completely abandoning the toxic woman who had aggressively forced him to forge my signature on the master land deeds. But Chloe did not wait for the final gavel to strike before she completely abandoned him in return. The absolute exact second the federal authorities froze their massive fraudulent bank accounts and the luxury bank repossessed her expensive lifestyle, she filed for an immediate, ruthless divorce. She viciously blamed him for the entire massive failure, completely legally severing herself from his ruined, pathetic life. Kendrick walked out of the federal courthouse, a completely free man, but he was entirely, absolutely stripped of everything he had ever foolishly taken for granted. His massive $4 million suburban mansion was legally returned to my private trusts. His expensive luxury vehicles were completely gone. His wealthy, fake, aristocratic friends instantly blocked his phone calls, pretending they had never even met him. He was left entirely bankrupt, legally homeless, and wandering the cold, busy city streets with absolutely nothing but the wrinkled, dirty clothes resting heavily on his trembling back. For 3 long, exhausting weeks, my son survived by sleeping fitfully in the cramped back seat of a cheap sedan he bought with the absolute last few dollars he had secretly hidden away. He ate cheap, stale food from gas stations and washed his face in dirty public restrooms, completely removed from the pampered, luxurious existence he had enjoyed for his entire life. Meanwhile, my massive commercial construction company was booming with unprecedented, powerful energy. The loyal union workers had proudly returned to all 14 active job sites, the absolute exact minute I formally resumed total control of Apex Development. The massive $500 million flagship commercial tower project in the center of the city was progressing rapidly, the heavy steel beams rising beautifully into the bright blue sky. I was standing directly on the active, bustling job site early one freezing Tuesday morning, wearing my yellow hard hat and my old cement-stained steel-toed work boots. I was proudly watching my dedicated, skilled men pour a massive load, bearing concrete foundation, when I saw a pathetic, familiar figure slowly shuffling toward the heavy chain-link perimeter fence. It was Kendrick. He looked absolutely broken, his face pale and completely covered in a thick layer of dirty stubble. His expensive, tailored clothes were deeply stained with dark grease and smelling heavily of cheap, stale sweat. He stood outside the heavy iron gate, nervously watching the massive, roaring construction machinery with wide, terrified eyes. He cautiously approached the burly Union security guard stationed at the main entrance and timidly asked if he could please speak directly to the owner of the massive company. The massive security guard looked down at the ruined, pathetic boy with pure, cold disgust, but he slowly unclipped his heavy radio and signaled for me to come to the front gate. I walked purposefully across the busy job site, the thick mud sucking loudly at the heavy rubber soles of my worn work boots. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from the heavy chain-link fence, looking directly through the thick metal wire at the broken, ruined sun I had entirely funded for over 30 years. Kendrick could not even look me directly in the eye. He stared down at his scuffed, dirty shoes, his thin shoulders shaking violently in the freezing, bitter morning wind. He placed his trembling, freezing hands against the cold metal fence and slowly began to speak, his voice cracking pathetically over the loud, roaring sound of the massive concrete mixing trucks. He desperately begged me for absolute, unconditional mercy. He did not ask to be magically restored to his massive corner executive office or legally reinstated to his stolen corporate throne. The cold, harsh, brutal reality of deep, crushing poverty had completely erased his profound, toxic, unearned arrogance. He wept silently, large, thick tears cutting clean, bright tracks through the heavy, dark dirt smeared across his hollow, pale cheeks. He frantically begged me for a simple, quiet junior desk job buried deeply somewhere inside the corporate headquarters. He pleaded desperately for a cheap minimum wage position, answering ringing telephones or filing boring legal paperwork in a warm, heated room. He promised repeatedly that he would sit quietly in a dark, forgotten corner and never, ever bother me or the senior executive management team again. He simply desperately needed a tiny, steady paycheck to afford a cheap, warm bed in a safe neighborhood because the cold, terrifying reality of the brutal city streets was rapidly killing him. I stood perfectly still, listening to his pathetic, desperate weeping, and I felt a sudden, heavy, powerful memory wash completely over my focused mind. I remembered the exact bright, warm morning he was born over 30 years ago. I vividly remembered standing inside a sterile, bright hospital room holding his tiny, fragile, warm body wrapped tightly in a soft white blanket. I looked down at his tiny, innocent face, and I made a solemn, silent promise to the universe. I promised that my newborn son would never, ever have to suffer the brutal, agonizing racism and the terrifying, crushing poverty I had violently endured during my own dark, difficult youth. I swore I would physically build a massive, impenetrable fortress of immense, unearned wealth around him to perfectly securely protect him from the harsh, unforgiving world. I bought him expensive private tutors, luxurious safe cars, and guaranteed him a highly lucrative executive career simply because he shared my last name. But as I stood looking at him shivering pathetically through the cold chain-link fence, I finally completely realized the massive, devastating, terrible mistake I had foolishly made. By successfully giving him the entire comfortable world, I had unknowingly violently stripped him of his own internal strength. I had aggressively protected him from every single difficult struggle, completely preventing him from ever developing a solid, strong moral spine. My massive protective wealth was not a warm, safe blanket. It was a highly toxic, slow-acting poison that had actively turned my only son into a weak, cowardly, easily manipulated parasite. He betrayed me and tried to steal my massive commercial empire precisely because he had absolutely no basic fundamental understanding of the brutal, immense physical sacrifice required to actually build it from the dirty, frozen ground up. I did not offer him a warm hug or a quiet desk job inside my heated corporate headquarters. I turned around silently and walked briskly over to a heavy yellow supply truck parked near the main entrance. I reached into the deep metal bed of the heavy truck and pulled out 3 specific items. I grabbed a bright neon yellow high-visibility safety vest, a rigid yellow plastic safety helmet, and a solid steel shovel with a thick wooden handle. I walked back to the heavy chain-link fence and instructed the massive Union security guard to unlock the heavy iron gate. Kendrick stepped nervously onto the active construction site, his eyes wide with desperate, pathetic hope, falsely believing I was formally welcoming him back into the safe corporate family. I stood directly in front of him and dropped the heavy steel shovel, the bright safety vest, and the hard plastic helmet directly into the thick, wet, freezing mud resting exactly at his trembling feet. I looked directly into his terrified, red-weeping eyes, my face a cold, unyielding mask of hardened stone. I told him he would never sit comfortably behind a polished wooden desk inside my corporate headquarters ever again. I told him he was officially starting at the painful bottom of the massive commercial construction ladder. You start at $18 an hour loading heavy wet concrete, I said, my voice slicing brutally through the loud roaring noise of the busy job site. You will sweat and bleed completely alongside the dedicated loyal men you previously arrogantly tried to illegally fire. You will work the exhausting physical shift every single day until your soft hands are permanently covered in thick, heavy, painful calluses. I pointed my large, calloused, scarred finger directly at his pale, trembling face, delivering the ultimate final condition of his new pathetic life. If you are late by a single minute, you are permanently fired. The heavy steel doors of the federal penitentiary slammed completely shut, erasing Darius from the civilized world for the next 10 agonizing years. The arrogant young interior designer who once stood in my luxury ballroom wearing an expensive velvet tuxedo was now wearing a bright orange jumpsuit. He stood before the federal judge and wept like a terrified child, loudly begging for a lenient sentence, but the severe judge showed absolutely no mercy. His massive wire fraud and illegal real estate extortion carried heavy mandatory minimums, completely destroying his pathetic, fraudulent life. He would spend the next decade locked inside a tiny concrete cell surrounded by violent, hardened criminals, completely entirely stripped of his expensive imported cologne and his customized tailored suits. He foolishly thought he could easily steal my massive commercial real estate empire, but he ultimately traded his soft, luxurious existence for a cold iron prison cell forever. Chloe completely lost her fake aristocratic blue blood lifestyle the exact second the elite private bank seized her massive fraudulent assets. Her bankrupt, snobby parents entirely refused to answer her desperate phone calls, completely abandoning her to the absolute harsh reality of total devastating poverty. The arrogant white woman who once proudly dripped in massive stolen diamonds and verbally abused my loyal construction workers was now completely humiliated. She was currently working an exhausting double shift as a common hostess at a cheap mid-tier restaurant on the dark outskirts of the sprawling city. She wore a cheap polyester uniform that chafed her soft skin, and she spent her entire miserable day politely smiling at rude, impatient customers just to earn pathetic minimum wage tips. Every single agonizing dollar she painfully earned went completely directly to the massive $15 million financial debt she could never, possibly realistically, entirely repay. My treacherous ex-wife, Camille, received absolutely nothing from the severe family court judge who formally stripped her of all unearned marital assets. She was entirely, completely, legally ordered to pay my massive, expensive corporate legal fees, leaving her totally, utterly bankrupt and completely socially ruined. I drove my heavy black luxury sedan slowly through a deeply neglected dark neighborhood on the absolute dangerous edge of the sprawling city. The crumbling concrete sidewalks were completely covered in thick, dirty trash, and the dim, flickering streetlights cast long, terrifying, dark shadows across the cracked pavement. This was the absolute, harsh, unforgiving reality she had always deeply, fearfully avoided her entire pampered, luxurious adult life. I parked my massive, expensive vehicle directly in front of a tall, decaying brick apartment building, completely, entirely covered in thick, ugly, faded graffiti. I stepped out into the cold, bitter wind, completely alone, and entirely unafraid. I walked slowly up 3 flights of steep, dark, completely unlit concrete stairs, listening to the loud, angry arguments echoing loudly from the cheap, thin walls. The hallway smelled heavily of stale, cheap cigarettes, rotting garbage, and deep, profound human despair. I stopped directly in front of a chipped wooden door marked with a tarnished brass number 7 that hung crookedly from a single rusted screw. I did not knock loudly or aggressively demand absolute immediate entry like a vindictive, angry man seeking petty emotional revenge today. I simply tapped my large, calloused knuckles gently against the cheap, thin wood, waiting patiently in the dark, silent hallway for her arrival. I heard the distinct metallic scraping sound of multiple heavy deadbolts being slowly, cautiously unlocked from the inside very quietly. The thin wooden door slowly creaked completely open, revealing the ruined, shattered woman I once foolishly loved so deeply before. Camille stood completely frozen in the narrow doorway, staring at my face with wide, terrified, bloodshot eyes. She was no longer wearing the incredibly expensive custom-tailored silk dresses or the flawless imported diamonds that once proudly, aggressively defined her entire vain existence forever. She was wearing a completely faded, dirty, oversized gray sweatshirt and cheap, stained sweatpants that hung extremely loosely on her remarkably thin, fragile, trembling frame. Her perfectly dyed, expensive hair was now completely graying at the unkempt roots hanging limply around her pale, exhausted, heavily lined face. Without the massive stolen corporate wealth to constantly aggressively fund her expensive cosmetic procedures, she looked entirely like a deeply broken, rapidly aging stranger today. I did not say a single word as I slowly stepped past her trembling body, entering the incredibly cramped, entirely depressing one-bedroom apartment she now permanently called her absolute only safe home forever. The tiny living space was completely, entirely suffocating, smelling faintly of cheap boiled cabbage and harsh industrial bleach. The incredibly cheap particle board furniture was deeply scratched and visibly peeling, completely lacking any trace of the luxurious Italian leather sofas she once lazily lounged upon. A tiny broken television flickered weakly in the dark corner, showing blurry local news programming through a thick layer of fuzzy static. I looked at the small, wobbly kitchen table, completely covered in unpaid utility bills and final eviction warnings. Staring at this pathetic, depressing squalor, my mind completely involuntarily drifted back to our 40th wedding anniversary morning. I vividly remembered standing proudly in her pristine corporate office, holding that massive, beautiful $15,000 custom diamond necklace tightly. I remembered the exact cold, heavy feeling of simply dropping that flawless, sparkling, shiny fortune directly into the dirty metal office trash can that terrible afternoon. Camille slowly, completely closed the thin wooden front door, completely terrified that her loud, nosy neighbors might actively overhear our intensely private conversation. She nervously wrapped her thin, pale arms tightly around her small, shivering chest, completely, entirely unable to physically look me directly in the eye. She stood silently trembling in the center of the completely faded, stained carpet, waiting fearfully for me to aggressively, loudly scream at her or violently break the cheap furniture. She deeply, truly expected me to brutally, maliciously gloat over her massive, terrifying, catastrophic downfall. She falsely thought I had specifically driven across the massive, sprawling city entirely to aggressively, loudly rub her pathetic, absolute, total failure directly in her rapidly aging face. But I did not feel any burning, violent anger or loud, petty, vindictive triumph pulsating actively through my calm, aging body today. I only felt complete, profound, absolute silence inside me. I slowly reached my large, calloused right hand deeply into the inner breast pocket of my perfectly tailored, expensive, dark wool suit jacket. Camille physically flinched backward, falsely believing that I was aggressively, rapidly pulling out highly damaging, destructive legal paperwork to further heavily destroy her totally ruined, pathetic life today. Instead, I slowly, quietly pulled out a single cheap, artificial plastic flower that I had casually, easily purchased from a dirty, dusty, neglected glass jar sitting directly on the worn front desk of the incredibly cheap $40 a night roadside motel. The cheap, fake plastic petals were brightly, unnaturally colored, a loud, vibrant, offensive pink, violently clashing with absolutely everything in the incredibly dim, utterly depressing, squalid room. I walked slowly, silently, deliberately forward toward the extremely small, wobbly, dirty kitchen table, completely, entirely, purposely, ignoring her loud, terrified, panicked, heavy breathing directly behind my strong, tall back. I gently placed the cheap, bright pink plastic flower directly onto the center of the scratched, wobbly table, right next to a massive stack of final, extremely urgent, unpaid electric bills. Camille slowly, cautiously walked up behind me, her bare, pale feet making absolutely no sound on the dirty, faded carpet. She looked down at the cheap, fake plastic flower, completely confused by my entirely silent, highly unexpected gesture today. I slowly, smoothly turned around and looked directly, deeply into her wide, terrified, bloodshot eyes. "Happy anniversary, Camille." I said, my voice completely flat, coldly, devoid of any residual marital affection or deep past human warmth. You finally, aggressively, forcefully got exactly what you desperately, secretly always wanted all along. You finally got a free, independent life entirely without my heavy corporate interference. She stared at me, her thin, pale lips trembling silently as the massive, absolute finality crushed her. I did not wait patiently for her to offer a pathetic, tearful apology or desperately, wildly beg for a tiny shred of financial forgiveness today. I simply walked slowly, confidently right past her ruined, fragile, shivering frame, completely leaving the dark, cramped, depressing apartment permanently behind me forever. I walked heavily, steadily down the dark, unlit concrete stairs, my heavy cement-stained steel-toed work boots echoing loudly, powerfully into the silent, bitter, cold night. I stepped confidently outside into the freezing damp air, deeply inhaling the crisp, sharp scent of ultimate, absolute, total victory. My massive $150 million commercial real estate empire was finally, completely, permanently, safely secure. The treacherous, greedy traders who had maliciously plotted to violently, brutally steal my life work were entirely, totally, completely destroyed. I climbed into the warm, safe interior of my heavy, luxury vehicle, ready to completely rebuild tomorrow. I am sitting quietly in my massive corner office on the top floor of the Apex Development corporate headquarters. The bright morning sun is shining intensely through the heavy floor-to-ceiling glass windows, warming my tired but deeply victorious bones. At 73 years old, I have finally reclaimed absolute total control of the $150 million commercial real estate empire I built from the freezing, dirty ground up. The massive, heavy mahogany desk in front of me is no longer cluttered with the useless, flashy marketing proposals and empty corporate buzzwords that Darius had foolishly scattered across its polished surface. The large room smells of rich, dark roasted coffee and fresh, expensive leather, completely entirely erased of the cheap, imported cologne my treacherous wife and her arrogant young lover used to pollute my quiet, private sanctuary. The massive empire is currently running more smoothly and highly efficiently than it ever has in its entire 40-year history. Without the massive, heavy financial drain of Camille's ridiculous luxury credit card bills and Chloe's fraudulent, expensive private jet memberships, our quarterly corporate profit margins have skyrocketed rapidly to unprecedented record-breaking heights. The loyal union workers have proudly returned to all 14 active job sites across the sprawling city, with a renewed, fierce dedication pouring wet concrete and welding heavy steel with absolute, undeniable pride. The massive $500 million flagship commercial tower downtown is completely back on schedule, the heavy steel framework rising beautifully and triumphantly into the bright blue Chicago sky. I am no longer a desperate, frightened man fighting to survive a brutal medical coup or hiding alone in a cheap $40 a night roadside motel. I am firmly, securely seated back on the massive corporate throne I painstakingly built with my own calloused, heavily scarred hands. But my profound, absolute victory over the treacherous, greedy traders inside my own family forced me to completely reevaluate the ultimate final destination of my massive, immense wealth. For over 4 decades, I had blindly, foolishly assumed that my massive financial legacy would simply automatically pass down directly to my bloodline. I had falsely believed that leaving a massive, enormous fortune to my cowardly son Kendrick was the absolute highest expression of a father's deep, unconditional love and protection. But the brutal, agonizing betrayal taught me a massive, unforgettable, painful lesson about the highly toxic, dangerous nature of unearned luxury and inherited wealth. I invited Sterling, my ruthless, brilliant corporate lawyer, into my quiet corner office early this morning to officially, formally, entirely restructure my massive estate. We spent 6 long, exhausting hours carefully drafting a completely ironclad, massive legal trust that is entirely, completely bulletproof against any future frivolous family lawsuits or greedy corporate challenges from distant relatives. I completely, permanently, legally severed my entire ungrateful bloodline from the massive $150 million corporate fortune. There will be absolutely no massive multi-million-dollar trust funds waiting for Kendrick when I eventually pass away. There will be absolutely no expensive luxury mansions or shiny, unlimited corporate credit cards handed freely to any future entitled grandchildren who refuse to learn the heavy, brutal value of a hard day's honest work. I completely, permanently cut the rotting, weak branches entirely off my massive family tree to ensure the healthy, strong roots could properly survive and continue to grow deeply into the firm soil. Instead of blindly funding another highly toxic generation of spoiled, arrogant, wealthy socialites, I directed the massive, overwhelming majority of my enormous liquid wealth and commercial assets into a permanent private educational foundation. The massive, newly established Vanguard Builders Trust is specifically legally designed to directly, entirely fund advanced trade schools and prestigious engineering scholarships for underprivileged, hard-working black youth growing up in the exact same rough, impoverished Chicago neighborhoods where I originally started my own difficult journey. I am dedicating my entire massive lifelong fortune to discovering and aggressively financially supporting the next brave, fierce generation of brilliant young commercial builders and ambitious architects. I want to gladly give those hungry, determined kids the massive, powerful financial tools they desperately need to safely, successfully navigate the completely corrupt, wealthy corporate world without ever having to compromise their deep personal integrity. I want them to firmly, proudly build their own massive, towering skyscrapers and confidently command their own massive corporate boardrooms without ever having to beg a racist, prejudiced banker for a simple, unfair commercial loan. I am ensuring that my vast, immense wealth will actively build strong, resilient communities rather than passively destroying soft, entitled individuals. As for my ruined, cowardly son Kendrick, his massive future inheritance is now strictly, permanently tied entirely to the heavy, solid steel shovel I violently dropped at his trembling, muddy feet. He will only legally ever receive whatever tiny, pathetic amount of money he physically earns through his grueling $18 an hour manual labor job loading wet concrete and hauling heavy steel rebar. My loyal veteran foreman Marcus sends me a highly detailed daily report regarding Kendrick's pathetic physical progress on the active, bustling job site. Marcus tells me that Kendrick spends his entire lunch break sitting quietly alone on a dirty, overturned plastic bucket, rubbing his painfully blistered, bleeding hands and staring blankly, silently at the cold, hard concrete. He is completely physically exhausted, his soft, pampered body violently rebelling against the incredibly harsh, brutal demands of actual, genuine physical labor. If he manages to somehow survive the freezing, bitter winters and the blistering hot summers pouring wet cement, he will eventually learn how to earn a simple, honest living just like any other regular working-class man. But the massive golden corporate financial faucet is permanently, securely, completely turned off forever. He is finally painfully learning the brutal, harsh reality of the unforgiving working-class world he previously arrogantly, entirely despised and constantly, openly mocked alongside his ruined, manipulative white wife. I slowly stand up from my heavy leather executive chair, feeling a deep, profound sense of absolute total peace settling firmly, warmly into my aging, tired chest. I walk slowly, steadily across the thick, expensive corporate carpet toward the massive panoramic floor-to-ceiling glass windows looking out over the sprawling, beautiful concrete skyline of the massive city I helped physically, boldly construct over the past 40 years. The sun is beginning to slowly set, casting a brilliant, warm, golden glow across the towering glass and steel structures. I look down at my large, calloused hands, remembering the thick, bleeding blisters, the aching joints, and the freezing, terrifying dark nights I spent sleeping in a cold, broken, unheated pickup truck just to make basic, weekly payroll for my loyal, dedicated men. Every single scar on my thick, dark skin tells a massive story of brutal survival and fierce, relentless determination. I turn away from the beautiful, glowing skyline and walk slowly back to my massive, polished, mahogany desk. I slowly, carefully sit back down into the comfortable leather chair, letting out a long, slow breath of complete, absolute satisfaction. I reach down slowly and unlace my old, heavy, cement-stained, steel-toed work boots. The exact same heavy boots I wore to violently crash the massive luxury corporate gala. I lift my heavy, tired, aching legs and gently, respectfully place the dirty, worn leather boots directly onto the pristine, polished surface of my incredibly expensive corporate desk. I lean back, closing my tired eyes for a brief, quiet, peaceful moment, simply listening to the deep, powerful, low hum of the massive commercial building actively functioning perfectly surrounding me. I am a proud 73-year-old king who successfully, fiercely defended his massive, impenetrable castle against the vicious, greedy traitors who were sleeping comfortably warmly inside it. The brutal, terrifying corporate war is finally, entirely officially over, and I am the absolute only man left standing strongly at the very top of the massive concrete mountain. I learned the hard way that protecting your family from the cold sometimes makes them completely blind to the warmth of the fire you built. When my wife chose a younger man and my son's wife chose greed, they didn't just break my trust. They freed my spirit. I realized that true loyalty isn't inherited by blood or guaranteed by a marriage certificate. It is earned through character. Wealth without integrity is just a shiny cage. Today I sit alone at the top of my empire, but my greatest victory was finally tearing down the illusions I funded. Did you find this story meaningful today? Have you ever had to cut highly toxic, manipulative people completely out of your personal life, even if they were your own close blood family? Let me know your deep personal thoughts and tell me exactly where you are watching from in the comments below. If you truly enjoyed this powerful journey of absolute justice and corporate redemption, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful, compelling stories of strength and survival. Thank you so much for listening, and see you in the next one.